meeting, and they are reflected in the plan. And some folks have sent us comments since then, and we're just gonna ask you to say them to everybody, see what people think, and try to get closer to a plan that everybody can agree on. So that's really what we're hoping to do today. Things like the modeling are very important. They tell us, you know, how many heat pumps, how many EVs, what do the emission reductions look like? And again, that's what we're gonna kick it off with. Before we get going, she's walking into the room with her laptop. I just wanna introduce Samantha Horn. So Samantha is in day 2 of the new director of the Maine Office of Community Affairs. So welcome, Samantha. Samantha's she's not a member of the Maine Climate Council yet. We probably should add her in law. Note to Melanie and I, we should do that. But I think as everyone in this room knows, so many of our strategies are reliant on us working with communities in Maine. From how we help them with climate planning, how we help them manage land use issues, housing issues, the kinds of conflicts and opportunities we've talked about in this climate plan. It really is about technical support, program support, somebody in state government you can call to help you. The governor has made this a real priority. The Maine legislature in the last budget approved the creation of this new office and the position of director. In the upcoming biennial budget, we will be transferring a number of programs, including the Community Resilience Partnership Program, some programs around land use from Judy East Shop, Volunteer Maine, code enforcement, the coastal portions of the coastal program, they will be proposed to be moved to the new Maine Office of Community Affairs. So we're really excited about that. We wanted to introduce you to Samantha because we really think that the work happening in communities is really what this climate plan is all about. The only other thing I want to say before we get going with the modeling and the full agenda is just a quick comment about tribal government collaboration. And I will just say we talked about this a little bit at least 2 climate council meetings ago. Molly and Bryant has been an incredible ally in this work. I wish she were here today, and she's somewhere very nice right now with her family on vacation. And the timing was too bad because Molly has been a real partner and an incredible asset to the Maine Climate Council in all that she's worked on with us. So she's not here, but she endorsed me saying this. She has made it very clear, and we talked about this at the last meeting, that tribal nations in Maine don't want to be treated as priority populations. They don't want to be sort of an equity group necessarily in the way that we often talk about it. They want to have a government to government collaboration on the priorities of tribal nations and the priorities of the state. Melanie and I met last week with the Wabanaki Alliance, which included representatives of all the tribal nations in Maine, to start to talk about the idea of an ongoing forum for collaboration. The Maine Climate Council Tribal Nation Collaboration Forum. It's a very long title, but that's the idea that we're talking about. Everybody in that group was on board, and we are now meeting with each of the tribal chiefs to seek kind of approval, interest, and seek representatives to be part of this. So we hope to kind of include that as I will say, like a sort of companion piece to the Maine Climate Plan, that the tribes are important to Maine. They have their own separate relationships with the federal government when it comes to lots of grant opportunities. There have been many places where the state of Maine, like the Community Resilience Partnership Program, like a lot of the natural resource agencies, are collaborating with tribes on grant opportunities. And we just see a lot of opportunity to figure out how to better work together on that going forward. So I know there's been some concern that's come to us about how we're, some tribal mentions as a disadvantaged population have been taken out, but that has been at the request of the tribes, or at least Molly and Bryant, who I think many of you know is now the executive director of the Wabanaki Alliance. So I will stop there. I'm happy to try to answer questions. I know Molly would be happy to answer questions as well when she's back. And we will keep this group posted. Again, Melanie and I see this as an opportunity to kind of elevate these issues and talk about them on behalf of the Climate Council. So we are always open to folks on the council's thoughts and feelings about how we might do this. And again, we actually imagine energy issues, emergency management issues, natural resource issues will come up, and we imagine engaging other state agencies and other Climate Council members as we think about how this can be successful. So I don't know, Melanie, if you have any other comments on that. Okay, great. So we'll get right into it. So Melanie and I are going to do some overview of targets, to kind of remind you of where we are, and to start to propose some next steps. And then we're going to get into the meat of how everybody's feeling and what we need to address.
Thanks, Hannah. All right, good morning, everybody. So you may recall last week, I think it was last week, things are blurring together a little bit. We talked about our emission reduction targets that are in statute. So before I go into that detail, I'll remind you all, we have emission reduction targets in statute. They are quantitative, but they're not the only thing that this plan is about, right? So last week, that's all we talked about. We just talked about numbers. We talked about recommendations and strategies that affected our emission calculations. What we're going to talk about today is the plan as a whole. And so those strategies that are related to emissions are woven into the plan, but they're just one part of our overall mission, which is to look at also resilience for the state of Maine, positive outcomes for Maine citizens. So I'm going to talk about numbers again, but I just wanted to preface it with there's a whole lot more in this plan that isn't just about calculating emission reductions. So our targets are to reduce emissions in comparison to 1990 greenhouse gas emissions. We're measuring gross greenhouse gas emissions. So this is everything that happens within the geographic boundaries of the state that results in CO2 being emitted, as well as several other greenhouse gases. But we generally talk about CO2 primarily. And most of our CO2 emission sources are from fossil fuel combustion, which you'll see in the department's biennial greenhouse gas report. So by 2030, we need to reduce our emissions 45% in comparison to 1990. And then by 2050, reduce them 80%. So you can see from the graph, we're well on our way. Our trajectory is good, but we know getting to that 2050 goal, that one's the one that's going to be really hard. So there are some pretty significant reductions that we need to look at between 2030 and 2050. In 2020, the way that we identified that we could get there was primarily by increasing the number of electric vehicles, a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, switching households in Maine away from fossil fuel-based heat to heat pump systems, and by weatherizing our households. So again, biggest source of CO2 emissions in the state is when we burn something. We burn something, we produce CO2. And so for every gallon of gas we don't burn, it's that much less CO2 that we emit to the air. So last week, we had a presentation from Evolved Energy Research. They have a model that they have run for other states as well. They plugged in our Maine Won't Wait 2020 targets, and then we asked them to look at several other potential scenarios. So all of the work that they did was designed to help us identify how to sort of turn the dials on these numbers to figure out how to meet those emission reduction targets. And you'll see, and as was discussed last week, one of the things that was considered is if we had a slower rate of EV adoption, and you see in some cases that sort of ratcheted up some of those other numbers. So as some of the numbers go down, that means some of the other numbers have to go up to get us to that endpoint. One of the newer concepts that was introduced was this idea of if we have a slower rate of EV adoption, that we could replace some of those CO2 emissions by switching to hydrogen as an energy source. This is a strategy that is being implemented in several other states. There's a significant amount of federal funding now that is pushing for hydrogen energy. So we're interested in exploring this, but you'll see that in the plan, this wasn't something that we focused a lot of our strategies on. So this is something that for now, I would say we're looking pretty closely at, that we've asked Evolved Energy Research to go back and do some more modeling runs for us. So apparently I get to break the news to everybody that we, depending on how our conversations go today, that we may need to use that placeholder meeting next week. So on Halloween by Zoom, if we have anything remaining that we need to cover, including nailing down some of these numbers, we're telling you now that placeholder is probably one that we're going to need to use. So similarly for 2050, as I mentioned, that's where we really have to ramp up some of these strategies to get to that pretty significant reduction in gross greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that covers it. If there's any questions, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer them. The model is a little bit of a black box for us. Includes economic considerations as well, which is part of why when they ran the numbers for us, hydrogen pops up because of all of those federal tax credits, that their model sees that as a real opportunity. We need to probably think carefully about whether or not that's really feasible, particularly by the 2030 timeframe for Maine. I'll turn that back over to Hannah.
So just to be clear, we shared with you last week what the modelers said. I think some of you asked us questions. We asked the modelers more questions. And as Melanie said, he's running a couple more scenarios to bring back to us. We'd love questions, comments, feedback as we start to talk about this. I think just to go back, I think we all felt, especially the transportation working group, that we need to be realistic about the number of EVs on the road based on our current trajectory. How do we encourage both EVs and plug-in electric vehicles and make that realistic? But obviously, if we reduce, there have been changes in the last 4 years. We have reduced emissions in other ways. We have a new baseline from the Department of Environmental Protection of what that 30% reduction looks like. So we are not running the exact same numbers compared to where we were modeling in 2020. But we still need data. Right, Ivan?
Right.
I don't see Susie. That we can all feel good about, and we also need strategies that we can back up what our modeling says we need to do. So we're going to keep drilling down on that. If anybody wants to be more involved, we're happy to keep you in the loop. But the idea is that we're going to bring back to you next, whenever Halloween is, Wednesday? Thursday. Sort of a game plan of what the additional model looks like. And we, again, I think we hope that we think it's realistic to include a lower number of EVs than we had in the plan 4 years ago, but we're going to see what the data brings us back. So I'm just gonna, I would say a lot of folks have been doing heavy lifting, especially the Energy Office, Efficiency Maine Housing, to think about some of the other targets we might set. And I think we have had a lot of exciting opportunities, especially through the infusion of federal funds that allow us to go much bigger on heat pumps, for example, in manufactured housing, retrofits of affordable housing in Maine, new housing that is electrified and highly efficient. And we think it's exciting and important to put those targets into the Maine Won't Wait plan. I think setting goals helps us be more ambitious. I see Michael Stoddard out there. Hopefully he's, hasn't had too much coffee this morning, because I'm sure he'll weigh in, but we're trying to be both realistic and ambitious when it comes to opportunities to ensure that especially low-income populations can take advantage of the technology that we're all so excited about, whether it's heat pumps, plug-in electric vehicles, et cetera. So we are looking for your feedback today, but we're trying to add targets for heat pumps. We had a target of 15,000 heat pumps for low-income households by 2025. I think the team can comment, but I think we are feeling fairly optimistic about where we'll be next year. And so the new target for 2030 is how do we continue that level of ambition? Getting to 15,000 low-income rebates often involve nearly 100% rebates, so that's a lot more funding than that then goes to other rebate types. So it's very costly, but it also can make a huge difference in people's lives. So we have a range, and I think we're open to questions and comments about that range today. Low-income homes weatherized, I think this is really important, but challenging work. And so we had a goal of 10,000 by 2030, and that continues to be the goal. We've added a new goal of new and renovated, clean and energy efficient affordable housing units. We were trying to reflect both the importance and the excitement of creating more housing for Maine people, especially affordable housing, and also the opportunity to renovate existing affordable housing. So we set a goal of at least 1,500 units per year. It doesn't sound like enough when we think about the 80,000 housing units the state of Maine needs, but this is a lot of heavy lifting. Maine Housing is not here today, but they push pretty hard on their teams, and this is what they came up with. Percentage of EV rebates to low and moderate income. The Transportation Working Group talked a lot about this, and the goal put out there is at least 50% by 2030. Percentage of climate infrastructure and resilience investments in disadvantaged communities. This is something I think Molly and the equity subcommittee leaders talked about a little bit at the last meeting. But there's an interest in setting a target of 40% of climate infrastructure and resilience investments going to disadvantaged communities. The definition we often use is the federal definition, which many federal grants come with right now. And that's this White House CGIS tool. We use a slightly different tool for our Community Resilience Partnership Program, but this seems like a good way to ensure that those communities in Maine, the rural communities, low-income communities, that don't have the grant writers all the time, that are not as good at figuring out how to access federal funds, have equal, if not slightly greater access to the significant infrastructure funds the state of Maine is seeing. The LMI households with rooftop solar or enrolled in community solar projects. This is a goal that the governor's energy office has set, and maybe Dan can speak a little bit more to it, but it's 15,000 households by 2030. And this is a reflection of the incredibly exciting $60 million in solar for all that the state of Maine has gotten, which I think has to almost entirely benefit low-income households in Maine. But again, I think we've heard from lots of folks that, you know, I think people see a lot of solar panels, but if it's not lowering their energy bills, they're frustrated. So trying to think about how we can help move the needle on that. So a couple others, we didn't have an EV charging goal in the last plan. Obviously, charging is incredibly important to our EV and plug-in hybrid goal. Clean energy, we had an 80% goal by 2030. The governor has set a 100% by 2040 goal. So we want to propose adding that to the plan. I think there's a hope that we put that in law in the coming year. The governor herself added the clean energy jobs when we released the climate plan in 2020. It wasn't officially part of the plan. We'd like to propose adding that. And then just a couple weeks ago, the state of Maine participated in a national announcement by 25 governors about increasing the number of registered apprentices by 2030. Maine has already done a lot of this work as we try to address especially construction workforce, but we think this is another exciting one to figure out how to get all the work done. So I think those are the kind of additions that we're, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Sorry, Dan. So I don't know, David, if we want to talk about these at all before we talk about other changes that have been made to the plan, but we want to put those out there. Again, this is the subcommittees and the working groups have spent a fair amount of time on this, but we absolutely want to hear people's opinions. So I'll pass it to David.
Yeah, so I think on both of these sets of targets, the targets that came out of the modeling effort, and then what Hannah just presented now, which are supplemental targets that really tries to make sure that everyone in Maine can be part of this story. There's a chance to ask some questions about it right now. If folks are broadly in agreement, that's great. We probably are going to need that October 31st meeting as well, just because there's some things we're working out with the modelers. But I'm curious, any reactions, particularly to what Hannah just presented, because that'll be the first time you've seen that, for those of you who were on the webinar last week. But any questions to what Hannah just presented, or what Melanie spoke about for the emissions things? Things that aren't clear to you, things you would want to make sure you understand better? And folks can introduce themselves just because we're online as well.
Yeah, Matt Marks, representing Associate General Contractors. Just because the slides up.
Yeah.
The clean energy jobs, I know we made a lot of progress on that, so Dan's office done a great job on assembling that. I don't know, Dan, you remember the number? I couldn't off the top of my head where we are now, but one thing I want to mention too, so there's a cross benefit here. We've got a lot of good clean energy jobs that are happening, but the folks are also doing other projects. So electricians are working in solar fields, but they're also working on vertical projects. And I don't know if we're capturing that because when there's lulls in any market, they transfer over. So I just want to mention that it has a dual benefit for training these folks. So I can't remember where we are. I think we made pretty decent progress in the last few years.
Dan, do you have that number?
Yeah, sure. So the,
And this is Dan Burgess.
Burgess, Director of the Energy Office, the DOE, just put out a new energy jobs report. We're going through that now. We're at about 15,000 before. We've likely seen 4 to 5% growth again year over year. So it's continuing to step up. They do full-time equivalents or some portion of the job. So some of that's captured, but not necessarily all of it too. So.
Other reflections or thought, Pat? Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Pat Stroud, Maine Forest Products Council. On energy costs with net energy billing, the issue we're going through right now. Have we thought about the economic implications for some of the recommendations coming to community?
Wait, and Pat, you're saying specifically with the solar, is the LMI solar target, which that brings that up for you?
Yeah, this final one down here,
Yeah.
LMI is low moderate income.
Yeah, minimize that cost.
Yeah, so the, appreciate that question, Pat. I probably should mention it when, state has received $52 million in a program called Solar for All, which is coming to the Energy Office. We applied for 99, we're getting 62, so we're busy negotiating with the EPA for what that will go for. There are 3 main programs that will come out of that: residential rooftop, and community solar, and kind of the mixed hybrid. The legislature gave us the authority to seek and apply for those funds, but it has to be cost effective. So we use those funds to buy down the cost of those projects and go for competitive procurement process, particularly on the effectively use those funds to administer a cost.
Thanks. I'm gonna jump over to Ken and I'll come back in.
Just a further response there, Pat. With net metering, it is possible to do a national rewards project. So far, most of those policy deliberations have been kill it, keep it. The rational food, but they are fine. Yeah, it's in the news, but we have manufactured. Then stranded costs. Some of not just make the same policy decision.
And let's carry that thought forward when we think about the content that we have on the energy section. Make sure that what's in that content is meeting that.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
People on that side of the room will need to speak up a little bit more. If you notice the green circles on the ceiling are
Oh.
only on this side. So unfortunately, if you're over there, you're gonna have to project more. We only have.
Where are the green circles?
Up in the. ceiling.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, we don't have the.
That's great. I wish someone had taken a picture of that. That would have been beautiful. All right. So yeah, if you could use your stage voice over here, that'd be fantastic. I didn't realize that we weren't capturing these mics here. Okay. Matt, you had another thing you wanted to mention that I want to make sure anybody else has.
You have Noel over here.
And Noel as well, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Pat said. So on the stranded cost piece there, and I know we're talking about renewables, but I mean, my understanding is that it was 40% or 60% of that also related to storm related costs. So I just want to call that out. Just we haven't had a discussion about that, and I don't know that we have a solid number related to that, but I think it is good for us to, at some point, maybe dive a little deeper into that. And I think the public probably is asking for that. I know the tax people probably clamoring for it. So
Right, we'd be a little clearer about what's going on
what's
there.
driving, and I know it's a formula too, and I know there's discussion around all that, but I do think from a climate council perspective, we should have that discussion about what's storm related, what's the cost of the programs. I think people think it's one bucket, I think, right now.
And that relates to the recommendations we have in the plan. Yeah. Noel? And don't forget to introduce yourself, sorry.
Sorry, Noel Bonham, AARP Maine. Building on what Pat said, but the flip side of that is connected to what he's saying is not just the producers, but also the consumers, right, with net energy billing. So for me, even before Pat brought that up, there's concern for me is who's going to be paying for it ultimately, right? And we're connected to net energy billing, and I think if we're not thoughtful about it, not proactive about it, we'll kind of be in the similar situation we are in right now, which I think was well-intentioned, but we had unintended consequences, right? So that's something I'd like for us to dig deeper into before we actually commit to it, so I know, who's actually going to be impacted by it. And beyond the money that the governor's energy office is getting, long-term sustainability, how is that going to be paid beyond the 62 million or 60 odd million, right, that we're getting? So that's one thing. Then, what I'm going to say now is kind of a very naive place because I don't know how things work. If we can add another source like hydrogen, it would be great. So we're not like putting all of our eggs in one basket, right? I mean, and so I do realize it might be very short time, but I think it'd be great for us to kind of think about what that would mean, even at this stage, to kind of be able to incorporate some of that, if possible. Yeah.
What I'm hearing with some of these comments is you want a little bit more detail on the implications of targets such as this. That detail hopefully is in the document, right? Hopefully it's, crush all the owl people, sorry about that. Hopefully it's in here, right? And so maybe later, as we're going through some of this content today, let's look, right? So if we have a bunch of targets that's trying to make sure that these kinds of technologies get to a broad range of Mainers, right? Are we comfortable we have the right strategies in place? The other thing I'll say is, Hannah's gonna say a word about funding before we get going on some of the content. And so that can hopefully help speak a little bit to what you're thinking about, Noel. Yeah, okay. So,
Francis Eanes was hoping to be here, but his child is sick. So I said, please don't come. And bring your sick child, and hopefully his child feels better. But he just sent me a couple comments that I will make on his behalf. And one is, he said he would like to see a more ambitious weatherization target compared to 2020, especially for LMI. So I'm just making that comment. And I think that's probably a question for Maine Housing and Efficiency Maine. This is by far the most sort of time-intensive and expensive work to do. So we do continue to push on that, but I'm just putting out there that Francis wanted me to share that.
I just respond, Housing Commissioner for Maine, I play that role as well. A part of that problem is funding. If we can identify funding, that would be possible. Because the board and staff really looked at that very, very closely. And so I just want to put that out there.
yeah.
Noel speaking on behalf, he's also on the Maine Housing Board. We've made Noel do a lot of things, so.
Okay. So our goal here with this is you as a council will be signing off, at least feeling like you can live with these kinds of targets, right? Ideally, today, you're in a place to start to gel on that, and concerns that you would have about signing off on these targets, we can surface them right now. We will gather back on the 31st and do a sort of more final, yeah, we can live with this, right? But I would say if there's something that's bugging you in here, now's a really good time to raise it up. Whether it's these targets or what Melanie was showing, there we go, some hands went up. Okay, Gary, and then I'll jump over to Judy.
Gary Lamb, representing MMA's, Maine Municipal Association's 400 towns. I think the goals are wonderful. The fuel for both solar and wind is cheap. But if we concentrate on that and put more of our eggs in that basket, are we also going to guarantee that we get to a kilowatt hour price of 50 to 75 cents by just doing that? I missed the modeling meeting and I was sorry, I'm not a modeling geek, but are we going to come anywhere nearer the per kilowatt hour price if we do all of this?
Good question. And that's a damn urgent question too, because simultaneously, what the Governor's Energy Office is doing is this Pathway to 2040 report, which is looking at these kinds of issues you're bringing up, Gary. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to say something about that in the intersection with these targets or.
Well, I think in the energy working group and in our office and in the 2040 plan, we've been talking a lot about affordability. I don't know that we talked about those numbers very specifically and where kind of those are coming from, but I think in tandem with this is also the cost of doing nothing, you know, and what that looks like. And so I think it's a balance, right? So we're happy to kind of go through the modeling kind of on the side or the other work.
No, the doing nothing part turns out to lead you to North Carolina and the storm damages and so forth. So there's costs associated with that too.
But I will just say, I think the Energy Office has actually been doing a big modeling project that may actually be out before next week. Did I say that?
Well, yeah, we're hopeful to have our, at least initial results of the 100% clean energy planning out in the next couple of days.
And you guys speak up on this side of the room.
They can't hear anybody that's speaking over there, so you're gonna have to repeat, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Anybody past Ken, they can't hear. We'll try to fix it during the break, but there's
Okay.
just no mics over there.
Thank you.
Maybe Dan, you should sit right in the middle of the room. So we can just hot seat.
Right, so you're hopeful that.
Yeah, well, I think what, I just want to say, what those results, and I think the results of the climate plan shows that cost of doing nothing is really expensive, and if you look at the overall energy wallet, the cost of policies like this are going to be lower. You're going to spend more on electricity, but less on fuel. And so I think that's some of the detailed dialogue we have.
Right.
I'll look at my
But
statement.
just to Gary's point, though, I do think we've seen large scale renewables. I think a lot of us are hopeful for some of the heuristic wind that may come. That's very low cost. And I think we don't need to get into all the details of solar and wind, large scale versus small scale, but there is very affordable clean energy that is on the grid when you buy it in large chunks. That's got sometimes land use challenges. But that is something we're balancing. And I know Gary had made the point to me the other day about just the need for baseload power that comes as part of the New England grid. And I know the Energy Office and others is seeking that affordable baseload power. I mean, 50 to 75% cent a kilowatt hour power is not something none of us want to see. Our climate plan is likely not feasible if that happens. And I think a lot of folks are working hard on affordability and clean energy.
Yeah.
Right, Dan?
Yeah, I think you said 5 to 7.5 cents, right? So you want to see the price go lower, but yeah, so we're working
I
on.
think he said 50 to 70.
It's 50 to 75 cents a kilowatt hour. We don't want that. Nobody
Oh,
wants
okay,
that.
I'm sorry. I thought that was.
Pursuing all those goals and getting to that is the loser for the state.
Yeah.
Depressed businesses are gonna close, people are not gonna be able to afford to pay their bills.
Yeah, and I think one of the findings on this as well is that it also doesn't allow the other pieces of the climate plan to work, right? Because the other pieces of the climate plan are about electrification of transportation, heating, et cetera. And so that doesn't work with the kind of prices you're talking about. So those things reinforce each other that you want to keep prices down to accelerate the rest of the climate plan as well.
I do think it's important to point out there's a really robust discussion about the costs and benefits of solar happening in the commission right now, with modeling and experts on both sides. And so we should just know that that conversation is happening at the Utilities Commission at the moment per what the legislature directed last session. So how those costs are being passed on or not in stranded cost filing, but then also how costs and benefits are showing up on bills or not showing up on bills. So that's happening in the commission.
Right, it's a place to look for that in the PUC. All right. Judy, you had a point, and then I
Pat
jumped.
is gonna talk to this conversation, so I can wait.
Okay,
You wanna talk to this?
yeah,
Yeah,
and
I just don't wanna, if we don't have affordable electricity for the forest industry, we're gonna have a problem and,
right, so what Pat's saying, sorry, I need to repeat,
The
yeah.
cost of doing nothing is prohibitive, because what we're doing now, we're making some policy decisions that are cost prohibitive. So we've gotta figure that all out.
My encouragement for Pat's comment, because maybe folks didn't hear it, was it's not okay for the forest industry to have high electricity prices. That's very scary. And what we should do is look at strategy C, right, later today, this morning, and see if we're getting to where we want to go in striking that balance of cost-effective, affordable power that also achieves climate goals. So let's look at that and see what it's working for. Judy?
With apologies to my neighbors, speaking loudly here. Judy East, Community Resilience Working Group. I like the, and it's only one resilience metric here, target. And I think we're missing a resilience metric, which has to do with community resilience planning, including assessing our vulnerabilities in choose the percentage of communities. And that has implications for where you put future development and where you intensify future development in keeping with the land use recommendations. So I think we're missing a target about the assessment of our vulnerabilities and where we plan for future development.
Judy, would you just suggest though that we have a number like number of Maine municipalities that have undertaken vulnerability planning?
Well, we in our report,
Yeah.
we did have some articulated language. It specifically said 100% of Maine communities, so we were bold, have refined any statewide or regional climate vulnerability assessments to describe their specific local vulnerabilities. So choose a different percentage, but it's that communities have got their own local needs.
You gotta take it off.
In that.
Hang on. How's that? Good.
That there is an assessment of local vulnerability in that context of what your regional and statewide vulnerabilities are. Those assessments are being done. And so it's missing.
Would you suggest a different goal by 2030?
Like 100% seems like a good 2040 or 20 something, but some percentage, a vast majority of.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick 60%. I'm not sure what the actual number is, but I just want to articulate the resilience planning part over and above what is there in terms of investments.
Does that seem workable for folks around the table here, counselors, that we would add some kind of target around the number of communities that have done this local scale resilience planning?
I just wanted to ask, so do we have a metric that quantifies that for all communities right now, that we know where we're at?
We've been tracking the number of communities who've enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership. That doesn't require them to do vulnerability planning. So we could set an additional target, as Judy suggests, of communities who have done that work.
So within that population of communities, but not all communities in the state. It'd be hard to make that statement for all communities in the state if you don't have a metric for it.
What if we circle back on October 31st and see what we could pull
Articulate?
together by then?
Yes. I'd love to
And
do
then we
that.
can look as a council at that to address your point of like, let's make sure we're looking at real data. Does that sound good?
It doesn't seem like anybody's gonna be opposed to that. Is that fair?
No.
Thank you.
Great. Super. All right, on targets, are there other things on targets that you'd want to say? We're on this slide, but remember there's some other slides too with some other targets. If folks want to just maybe scroll through those slides again. Again, this is a time to lift up any concerns you have on targets. And as is happening, also it's giving us a window of what we really want to check in on the document when we look at the document later this morning.
David,
Michael
Michael, and
Stoddard's got his hand raised.
Michael, go ahead, please.
Morning, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. Can you hear me okay, David?
You're like super loud.
Turning you down, Michael, you're very loud.
Exciting. Go ahead.
I'm not sure there's anything I can do on my end.
There you go,
to
there you go, you're
affect that.
perfect.
You're good.
Okay. So I'll try to keep this high level, but since I'm one of the guys that does the implementation of things like this, I'm pretty focused on the weeds. The heat pump rebates target in the first row. It occurs to me that it might benefit from clarifying a little bit what the units are that we're trying to measure. We might give one rebate to a homeowner that puts in a single mini split heat pump. We might give one rebate to a homeowner that does their whole home with several mini split heat pumps. We might give one rebate to a developer of a new affordable housing complex that has 60 apartments in it. Those would be 3 rebates. But it's not the same number of heat pumps at all of which serving low-income customers. So I'm a little interested in how we count the units. My bigger issue is that I've done some very crude back of the envelope calculating on costs, and we've recently developed our budget at Efficiency Maine for doing heat pump programs through 2028, fiscal year 2028. The total dollars we have available for that, just for low income, are over $70 million just for low income. And I'm ballparking here, but I think it would be more than an additional $100 million to afford to pay low income heat pumps to get to the $50,000 units, if what you're talking about is 50,000 heat pumps by 2030. So over 2 years, you need to come up with another $100 million. I just don't know where that comes from, especially since we will be presumably exiting this period of time where we've been so fortunate to get a really significant amount of federal funding. So I just feel very hard pressed to envision a pathway to 50,000 units by 2030. So I'm just trying to put that little reality piece out there. The other thing I would say is that on the EV stuff, it might be helpful to, I assume you're thinking of the percentage of light duty vehicles, because if you said 50% of all of them, it wouldn't really leave you any room to do. I just don't think you'd have much room to do work on medium and heavy duty vehicles. So that might be a useful clarification. My personal preference is counting percentage of budgets instead of percentage of rebates. I just don't, I think you want to set the percentages for the units that you're trying to, that really matter. And so I don't know whether rebates, again, is the right unit of measurement there, but those are 2 comments that came to mind first.
So Michael, if I were to summarize those 2 comments, one is on the EV rebate thing, let's think about funding amount as opposed to number of
And
rebates.
he means light duty.
You mean heat pumps? Sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh,
No, you're right. You're right.
Okay, sorry, I started at the bottom. I'll start at the top. On the heat pumps thing, the 50,000 heat pumps sounds like a ton of money with unclear where it would come from. You'd be more inclined to do something a little lower than that, judging from the amount of funding that would require. So from the 40 to 50, my guess is you'd probably be closer to the 40, if not lower. Right? And then, yeah, is that fair? Yeah, and then on the EV thing, is it possible to do it as percentage of budget as opposed to percentage of rebates? Or maybe that comment.
And I think, I
applied to
will just
both.
say, I think we intended for light duty. We're not talking about medium and heavy duty vehicles with that. So that's a good clarification, Michael.
Yeah, okay. Great.
And I guess my last comment would be, given that this is the Maine Climate Council and we're focused, the reason for being was to make plans for how to bring our state into a sustainable place and reach carbon reductions. I think in the future, it would be useful to think about additional levels of targets. There's no targets in here for businesses. There's no targets in here for manufacturing, industry. They all are big, important, not only contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, but also savings opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I recognize that there's a tremendous focus and tremendous importance on the equity element, and it got a lot of attention in the past, in this current round of the council's work and in the climate action plan, but it's resulting in lots of attention and thought about good targets that we can put on, which you see on the screen. But it's I think it's maybe would be valuable in the future to complement these targets with other targets for other sectors of the economy, because they are so important in terms of both the economy, but also where the greenhouse gas cuts can be found.
Thanks, Michael. Okay. Other things on targets to say before we finish up this conversation? Like I said, we'll circle back on the 31st and nail this down. Jesse.
Just yell, Jesse.
Okay. I'll be the one to ask the stupid question. Hydrogen, we're just gonna slide that in there. What is it? Where do you get it? What is it for?
Well, and I will say, that's why Melanie said what she said. So our modelers came up with a model that said across the country, hydrogen, there's a new significant federal tax credit for hydrogen. It will be economically, they say, feasible to transition into certain uses in the economy as an energy source. That's what their model shows as an economic opportunity for the state. We're like, okay, great, excellent. And then I think we all were like, okay, well, what does that mean? And so we have had that further conversation. I mean, Dan and I think I said this on the webinar, we were just in Denmark with the governor, and we saw a huge port with big, what do you call them? Electrolyzers, making green hydrogen with onshore wind power, and it was, you know, producing power to power vehicles and buildings and a district heat system in Denmark. So it exists in the world, it exists in this country, but will we have that in Maine? What will the use case be for it? I think that those are the questions we started to also ask when the modeling came out. So I don't know if Dan's team has done a little more work on it. I will say the legislature did pass a bill this past year to procure, if cost effective, a certain amount of hydrogen. I think for energy production, electricity.
So it's a 20 megawatt pilot for the production of hydrogen.
To produce hydrogen in Maine.
Yeah. So, I mean, hydrogen is used in the economy today. There's new ways of producing it. You can do it through, you know, there's many colors. That's how they kind of do it, blue, brown, what have you. Green hydrogen is using clean energy, excess clean energy to produce into an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen. If it is burned or used on its own, there's no emissions. If it is mixed into a pipeline or, you know, as a drop-in fuel, it will contain similar emissions as that fuel. And so I think the federal government has new tax credits, new funding opportunities, but also has hydrogen hubs, which have been kind of funded throughout the country. We were not successful in getting our hydrogen hub, but the legislature did pass a pilot for the Public Utilities Commission to implement by the end of next year to get us started to see what that looks like.
And Jesse, I would say as a layperson myself, what was helpful to understand the whole hydrogen story is you can take hydrogen that you make from clean energy and create hydrogen, and then you can create what's called hydrogen derived fuels, which can mimic fuels you would put in your vehicles or whatever. And so it's different than, say, a hydrogen fuel cell or other ways. So there's a lot of movement in the hydrogen space right now about how it would actually find its way into the economy. And that's what's going on. But again, there's more conversation to happen, hopefully on the 31st next week. We can say a little more definitively, oh yeah, this is why the modeling, it makes sense with our climate action plan.
Well, that's 100% more than I knew 5 minutes ago.
Jesse, we've all been on a journey to be like, okay, you put in the model. How would we do this and what does that mean?
Yeah. And
So,
it may require
Yeah, you're-
a line. It may require, in addition to this climate action plan that we decide to do today or later that says, you know, work to seize opportunities on hydrogen, blah, blah, blah. It's not in there already. Right. Matt is on same issue?
On hydrogen, yeah.
Yeah.
I do have an addition on the building side. That's what we talked about. But on hydrogen, there are interested parties who I know are exploring development here in Maine, and I think sending that positive message in the support will be really helpful. Also from a marketing perspective, that Maine's open to doing that.
And what Matt Marks just said was that there are interested parties in Maine on exploring hydrogen from an economic standpoint, business standpoint, and sending a message through a target or this plan would be helpful.
Kathleen Neal, I just wanted to add, as Dan alluded to, there are different kinds of hydrogen, and so we just want to be thoughtful in that recommendation that we're clear about the kinds of hydrogen that we are interested in pursuing and the kinds that we're not, right? So we don't want to fall into that, oh, magic wand.
Right.
and I will say the modelers did clarify for us that the hydrogen in the model is green hydrogen. Or else it wouldn't have had the same emission reduction benefits, at least as we understand them right now.
Very challenging on the whole accounting. Jay?
Thank you, Jay Cam, Northern Maine Development Commission. I actually don't disagree with the targets, but I do question the sustainability. I guess is maybe the best way, and I thought that's where Noel was somewhat going. I'm gonna use just as an example, like rooftop solar. I don't know what that does to insurance costs. Is an insurance company going to pay for damages in those, or what's the cost going to be? Also, I guess I don't know what the Maine Fire Marshal's office may say. Can they access a building, through solar panels and those kind of things? So from a public safety standpoint, I guess I would be concerned of the policy or the target. And the other thing, just briefly, I would agree with, Michael's comment on business and industry. Being from Aroostook County, agriculture is just using huge amounts of energy, especially right now with the crops in the blowers and all that going. So I think that resonates with, I think, our area.
Yeah, that's great. On the rooftop solar thing, I mean, again, putting Dan Burgess on the spot all the time. There is a ton of rooftop solar in Maine and across the country, and I'm sure the issues of insurance and public safety have been, part of the story there. So I don't know if there's anything to say about that, if there's any pending issues or whether that's highly vetted.
No, I appreciate the point. There's 15,000 projects in Maine right now. Majority of those are rooftop. So there's a robust rooftop industry in Maine right now. These projects will kind of move that forward. But I think it's a good point, right? There needs to be training on safety with local fire departments. Continue to also think about, we're doing that with energy storage, with electric vehicles, things like that. So continuing to engage with public safety is really important. But there is kind of an existing market with this, where it's happening today, so it's about kind of utilizing some of those best practices.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, let's do a couple more and then we'll take a break, because I feel like we're merging into the document itself, beyond the targets. Chris?
Chris Kessler is representative from the legislature. This is a question. How did the benchmark of 16% AMI come to be and that 29%? Is that from the CEJST tool?
Wow, so a lot of acronyms there.
Why don't you just say, I think that the benchmark column is actually just meant to provide information. And honestly, Michael and I were even emailing about what the definition of low income is in Maine. And for most housing, LIHEAP programs, it is 50 to 60% AMI. And I think Molly in that column was just trying to share the information that 29% of households in Maine are at or below 60% AMI. So like for the next number, 10,000 low income homes weatherized, that would be 29% of total rebate. So she's basically just showing you that it would be equal to the percentage of low and moderate income households in Maine. So the benchmark, correct me if I'm wrong, Molly, is mostly just trying to provide context about the goal, not,
Yes.
it's not an actual benchmark.
It's not new stuff. That's just like, this is what it is today in terms of the sort of
Well,
percentage.
this is how many households there are at or below 60% in Maine, 29%. That's not a goal we have, that's the census data of how many people are at that income level in Maine.
That's what that is. It's just context. Yeah, Joyce?
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quick in
And it's
response,
Joyce Taylor from,
oh, sorry, from Maine DOT Transportation Working Group. That just got from, Hannah's office at GoPIP, and I have been working with the fire marshal's office as well as there's a fire association on responding to EV fires and such. And so just to put it out there again, there is ongoing work with public safety around, issues with looking at batteries.
right. Thanks, Joyce. Okay. All right. Noel and Michael's back online, but Noel first and then go ahead. Yeah.
I'll be quick. I think that's right, Jay. I was kind of talking about, what you brought up and also the financial sustainability beyond any kind of funding we're getting right now, beyond the current administration, all of that stuff, right? So that. And what Gary brought up and what Pat brought up, and I don't feel like it's reflected in the language in this document, is the affordability, right? I mean, we're really talking about accessibility here, making this available to people by creating access. But the affordability and the viability of it is some of the stuff that's coming up here. I don't think we're talking about that as much even in this document. So I just want to put that on the table so we look at that. Yeah.
And yes, absolutely. And when we look particularly in strategy 3 around energy and energy burden, let's look at the kind of things that we have in the document and see if they are getting at the affordability issue in a way that maybe it's not as apparent in the targets. Yeah. Michael, and then I'll jump over to Matt. Michael Starler.
That might have been from before.
Is that an old hand, Michael?
Yes, it's an old hand.
Okay.
To comment on your age, is that?
Matt Marks.
Now, I'll be brief. On the housing goal, I like that. One thing I would add is that, we're about to adopt the new building code here. And I think it's a missed opportunity not to take the work and the study that the Maine State Housing Authority did in Hannah's office, and our goals overall for housing production, not just affordable workforce housing, whatever the category may be, and put that there because that's what's happening. So I think we've got that pocket, which goes through Maine State Housing, which is great. But I also think we should look at the overall global piece of housing that's going to be built to those standards anyway, that we should try to reach, and the report's already done. So I think it'd be a good measure for the Climate Council to know, are we meeting that demand and are those being built to that standard?
Great, so just take the already completed report and its goals, insert it into here.
Yeah, because I don't think the measurable piece of that, we wanna match that up to how many of those were built in those that fall under the jurisdiction of LUCAC enforceability, which is, communities 4,000 and above. And it's a pretty it's a lofty goal, but they're making good progress on it.
Okay, online folks, I'm not sure you heard all that, but essentially it's inserting other goals that have already been set through Maine Housing and GoPIP into this document. Okay. All right. So what I wanted to do before we take a break, assuming we're okay here and we're going to circle back on the 31st and really settle into this with the good comments that were made today. I wanted to do a quick sort of pre-work to get us into this document. All right. So when we all met on the 25th of September, you all provided some really helpful feedback on the framework of this, which was basically the core recommendations in the climate action plan. And if you remember, I took a lot of notes in that meeting. We sent those notes out over email later as sort of a punch list. And then GoPIF staff and others and the co-chairs figured out how to incorporate that feedback into the document. So Molly's made a nice slide. Molly, you and I will tag team on this, if that's okay?
Yeah.
So these are some of the things that's happened since we last sat around a table and looked at this content. Again, last time it was a thinner document we're looking at because it was just the sort of headlines. Now we've got more text, but in that more text, this is what's happened. On transportation, you can see here, there's some specific actions that were added about the public and active transportation, because that came out loud and clear, both in the report from the Mitchell Center and from you all. And so there's an added emphasis on public and active transportation, which we call reduced vehicle miles traveled. But, and what Joyce just said about the public safety issues that Ann Hughes brought up, like, let's make sure that that's in there. And also about resilience of the transportation infrastructure. So all that made its way into a new version of this, like what you have in front of you now, okay? Thanks to the input from last time. On buildings, what kind of detail was added to the housing recommendation?
Yes, great
Molly?
question. So the housing recommendation, there were a couple of different points from various chapters in the plan that referenced or related to affordable housing. And in order to really strengthen that point that we need to be working towards the state's housing goals, we consolidated some things into one place. So for example, there's a point about encouraging folks to adopt highly efficient manufactured homes that was not in the affordable housing section, but we thought that that really does relate to the supply of housing. And so we put that into that section.
Great, super. And the same thing in clean energy, added resilience of the grid as one of the actions, given the comments you all made. On the jobs, added details to that chapter, including more emphasis around registered apprenticeship, which was something that came up, and Francine's and others encouraging that language. Strategy E, which is the natural working lands and waters. First of all, and waters was added, thanks to input. I can't remember someone, I'm looking over between Bob and Carl, and maybe it was
Water's important.
Patrick.
We agree.
We like water, okay. And then heightened emphasis on resilience and nature-based solutions, things that came up in our conversation last time. In the resilience section, Molly, can you say just a little bit of, again, what happened in there and the sort of consolidation?
Yes.
Because you have that detail way clearer than I do.
Yeah, so folks might remember that in the framework, there were actually 3 recommendations that related to land use. And that was a lot of work that went into creating those recommendations. And we also felt that it was important to make those all fall under one recommendation. So we did quite a bit of consolidation and, strengthening some language here and there. And then also around the working waterfronts, we heard loud and clear from the folks in the coastal and marine area that they really want strong call outs to the importance of working waterfronts. And so we tried to just call out and emphasize the language around what we're talking about when we talk about preserving this important infrastructure.
Super. And then in strategy G, remember how much we talked about navigator programs and assisting people in navigating? So there's more discussion around navigator programs in strategy G. And then overall, there were some things that were in the previous plan that weren't a heavy focus of the working group discussions, but were important. I'm thinking combined heat.
Yep, combined heat and power, which I think was a point that
Had more explicitly part of this plan as well. Because there wasn't any decision to not have it, it just didn't make it in. So those are some of the things that resulted from our last conversation, and you should see them all here, right? That's what happened. Now, I'm trying to be thoughtful about the request to take a break and fix our audio issues.
the audio seems to be working magically now,
Alright.
so I don't think that's a huge issue. If anybody's online, please let us know if it's not working, but it sounds like good now.
Great. So now, this draft in front of you reflects these changes. And we are super grateful for input that came in over the survey as well, which helped provide a little bit of, some of it came in a little too late, but we were able to put some of it in here, and some of it's not quite in here yet. And our job now is to take some of the things that maybe didn't make it into this draft, and make a punch list of those and figure out how we want to deal with that. Before we do that, the issue of funding, Noel put on the table, others put on the table, Michael mentioned it. And so we anticipated you might say something about funding. And Hannah is gonna give us a little overview of some funding, that'll give some context about the overall plan and the overall funding, landscape.
Yeah.
So Hannah, why don't you do that, and then we'll get into some content.
And this won't be perfect, but I just wanna try to reflect on where we were in 2020 compared to where we are today and how we're thinking about it for the plan, and it's definitely something open to everyone's feedback. So I think as many of you will recall who spent many, many hours with us on Zoom in 2020 trying to finalize the first climate plan, we were in the middle of COVID and we had a very bold climate plan, and we were in the middle of a tremendously bad economic period for the state and the country. So we put out a plan and they were all like, okay, how are we gonna pay for any of this? And we were actually, working with the governor on a bond package to start to make modest investments, and the climate plan itself said, these things are important to do. We're gonna try to figure out how to start funding them. And we didn't, we put out a bond package, or we started to work on a bond package that would get us there. But we weren't honestly entirely sure. We had things like what Efficiency Maine does, we had other programs, but they were not at the level it was going to take to implement this plan. I would say since then, this is all the acronyms you're familiar with. We had the American Rescue Plan Act pass in 2020-21. The state got $1 billion that we use for infrastructure, workforce, and business recovery. We put a lot of funding into things that have been helpful to this climate plan. The bipartisan infrastructure law passed, a 5 to 10 year federal law with tremendous investments in transportation, environment, resilience, broadband, and energy systems. Those funds have been felt significantly in Maine. I think over $2 billion have been awarded to our state. More years left in these programs before they run out. I think a lot of BIL is at least 5 years. So we are using these funds from everything from grid resilience to culverts, significant broadband, lots of other resilience opportunities. It's how we funded electric vehicle infrastructure. So that has been a huge opportunity for us. Then in 22, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, which is where a bunch more climate programs have passed, as well as tax credits. Talked about the hydrogen tax credit, lots of tax credits for production of clean energy, tax credits available to nonprofit and state government and government institutions through something called direct pay. All of these programs were passed by Congress. They can't be undone unless Congress decides to repeal them, and they are in effect through 2030. So those are things that the modelers have reflected in our plan. They allow consumers to get $7,500 rebates when they buy an electric vehicle. They allow lots of other opportunities for all of the things we're trying to do in our plan. Chips and science is a smaller part, but I think many of you know Maine was designated a tech hub for forest bioproducts. There have been opportunities where manufacturers in Maine are investing in energy efficiency through that. So I don't mean to just bury you in all this federal language, but since we did the climate plan, these things are in effect. These things will help fund a lot of what we're trying to do in our climate plan, but not entirely. Things like what Efficiency Maine does through their triennial plan, that is an additional layer. Opportunities where the state government has funded programs we're all working on are another layer. So I will just say we are in a completely different landscape, and a lot of these funds do last through 2030. So that's good news for trying to implement this climate plan. There are still gap areas, and I will just say, very clearly the need for land conservation programs to help meet our 2030 30% goal have been put out there. I'm sitting with the I won't call them a mafia, but the Working Waterfront crew right here, and huge interest in making sure that we are continuing to make Working Waterfront more resilient. We know that there's probably no amount of money that we could put into resilient infrastructure and get the job done. So huge need for that to continue to happen. So I think so far we've made a decision in the climate plan to not put a lot of specific numbers out there, because some working groups put out a big number and said, we need this amount of money. Other working groups said, we need a lot of money and we're not sure how to get there. We are thinking as a staff about an implementation section of the climate plan that will talk about how do we leverage the kind of funds we need to get there. we are, I think, heading into a legislative session where the financial picture is not as rosy as it's been in some past years, so we're trying to balance that. So I will just say, we're open to comments and feedback on all of this. We have largely not put specific dollar amounts, because this is meant to be a four-year climate action plan. A lot of our goals go through 2030 and 2050, and we honestly have not the clearest understanding of how things are all gonna work. So we're trying to put more out the ideas and the emphasis of where funding is needed. So I that's probably more than needs to be said, but again, we'd love feedback. The sort of not inclusion of certain numbers were not meant to sort of dissuade people. It's just that every working group looked at this very differently, and it was starting to create kind of an uneven message about what was important, so.
And is it fair to say that last time around in 2020, one of the great values of having the climate action plan and its sort of set of clear ideas was that when funding showed up, Maine was ready to rock and roll. It was clear what it needed to do, right? And so one of the great values of a plan like this is setting out priorities and ideas, even if you don't have every dollar locked down, and sort of being able to react in the moment more nimbly if you're able to have a plan.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
And that doesn't mean you can't say we need more money for X. I mean, I think we've certainly identified that there are certain things in the climate plan that were well-funded and certain things that we still don't have a plan for funding. So please feel free to emphasize the places where you think there needs to be emphasis, because we don't have a pathway to pay for them, so. Melissa.
Could you just speak a little
A little
to,
louder too.
could you speak to the role of private funding? Wasn't like the community resilience program initially funded by some private funding, and is that just so minimal that it's not really worth talking about, or?
No, I mean, I would actually say, I can't remember, but I feel like in how we engage everybody in Maine, the role of private philanthropy, private capital, how we think about those financing mechanisms is incredibly important. And some of you in this room are also involved in the state's resilience working group. Deborah Elwood from the Maine Community Foundation is on this climate council, and she's on the resilience commission as well. And I would just say, like, we have seen huge opportunity with philanthropy in Maine, helping us start projects, prove that they work, and then seek additional state or federal funding for them. So I think that's a really, I mean, I think we've tried to say that private philanthropy cannot, fund all the things we need to fund, but it can at least help. I don't know if Deborah's out there and wants to say any more to that, but I mean, Melissa, I think that's a really important point. Philanthropy has even helped to fund the work of the Climate Council and the work, they helped start the Community Resilience Partnership Program. So they've been a huge ally, and I think that's a good point to make.
Dan?
Dan Cleveland, small business representative on the Climate Council. I'm glad we got around to the topic of funding. I think one of the concerns I've had that were, I think, in large part alleviated by the federal government stepping up in 2020 are going to start to reappear again, because these funds are not infinite. They are going to go away, and call me skeptical. I don't know that Washington DC is going to come in with the same type and give us the same type of funding that it did throughout the pandemic. So we're going to have to, it's inevitable, we're going to have to start coming up with our own ways to fund these projects if we're going to meet these goals. And I don't know if we've ever done any economic modeling. We probably have, and I haven't seen or I missed it. So what is the true cost of all these? If we were to achieve these goals, what's it going to cost, and what's the gap? My guess is pretty significant between what we already have procured through either federal loans or grants and what it's actually going to take. And so I know we've talked about, I know there was legislation passed about a Maine Green Bank, which I think is, I know Michael can probably talk more about that. My guess is that's still not nearly sufficient to draw the kind of private capital. I think this is to Melissa's question, not just private philanthropy, I mean private capital, people who want to deploy their money to these projects and earn a return on their investment. I would like to see maybe more analysis of what's needed, and then what tools can we implement here at the state level to help us bridge that gap. And I think a lot of it inevitably is going to require leveraging private capital because the government, either in BC and certainly in Maine, is not gonna have the resources available. So I love all these ideas,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'd like to see a little bit more meat on the
Yeah.
bone or analysis of cost and how we can actually bring this stuff to life because it all costs money.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
And again, I would say, when we go through some content now, if it's really not there, then let's think about, does it need to be there right now? Or do we need to put a line in there that says, hey, Maine, you better do this analysis so you're ready to go when this federal funding dries up and you've got the tools in place, whether it's to attract private capital or other types of things.
Yeah, there is a section here which about the resilience bank, which
Yeah.
I noticed, which is, I don't know, something, I think the language is study the feasibility by 2026 of a resilience bank, which its scope is limited to resilience projects, not to electrification projects,
Yeah.
et cetera. I think maybe we should be a little bit more firm.
Yeah.
And by 2026, we want recommendations. We want recommendations about not just resiliency, funding resiliency-based projects. but
You want to
also-
be more ambitious.
Yes, I want to
Yeah.
be more ambitious. Thank you.
Great. Other questions on or comments on funding?
David, there was just, I wanted to read out, Susie Arnold put in the chat that on the point of private philanthropy, that there were folks on a panel that was put on by the Maine Community Foundation talking about, for their climate interested donors to talk about this very thing. So there are discussions happening among private philanthropy about funding climate action.
Great.
And I just want to even say to Dan's point, I think that's a good push because we've been talking to CEI and FAME. We've had some larger private impact investors sort of say, how could we help invest? And frankly, all these federal things are not easily accessed by some organizations without finance mechanisms. So Francine brought that up actually is how can we develop those for schools, for state and local government? So I think that's a good push to kind of put something more bold in this plan. Deborah Elwood has her hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi there, can you hear me okay? Really sorry I couldn't be there today. I'm from Maine Community Foundation. Thanks, Hannah. I do want to note that of course philanthropy, there's no way philanthropy can replace government. And the real role of government is to support a lot of this. But we see a lot of donors and a lot of others who are really interested in potentially supporting pilots, supporting the development of local capacity to be able to respond to a lot of these things, perhaps any seed money, filling gaps, et cetera. So, we are really eager to identify where philanthropy can be most helpful. And I'm really happy to be part of the conversation. So thanks.
Thanks, Emma. That's great. All right. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, everyone. So there's one thing I want to do. We had scheduled a break at 1:15, and I think let's keep it. Folks, all right, it's a little warm in here. Sorry about that. We were also just informed that the AC is not working or something. That's why the door's been open, and apologies for the noise. The one thing I'd like to do before we go to a break, and this is not to solve all the issues, but I like to make a punch list of what you all want to talk about for the rest of this meeting to make this document stronger, right? And more importantly, make it to something you all can live with. Okay? Many of you provided some comments over the survey. Others of you have provided some comments, other documents. So we have a sense of what might be out there. But I'd like to make a punch list before we go to a break of what is it we want to talk about. And then we're going to make a systematic effort after the break to bang through that and see if we have some agreement about potential changes on those issues. All right, so that's what I'd love to do right now. So let's think about what is it in this document that is giving you heartburn or you think is an enormous missed opportunity that needs to have a better articulation. Yep. Melanie, you've got one?
I do have one. Well, so,
Melanie.
right, oh my God, just kidding. Given all the conversation about energy costs, and David, I heard you say it multiple times, and I know we're gonna dive into the document, and I think this might just take care of it. On page 21, the paragraph that is in strategy C, I would suggest that we should add some kind of statement about it being a priority of the council, the implementation of these strategies does not increase electricity costs for Maine consumers. That just a broad value statement so that all of these strategies, particularly around energy, are viewed through that lens. That, I mean, I've heard it resoundingly this morning and feel like that, you know, there's a lot of things Dan has explained that we're doing about that, but to have the council reflect that as an important priority.
Great, and I wonder if Dan Burgess might have some suggested language around that, and we don't need to go there just yet. But that's a great thing. So we know that cost was one of the things we talked about this morning. That's one area where we could look to fix it or address it. So energy costs is clearly one thing. I don't want to do more rounds on energy costs because it's in the punch list. If you got something else besides energy costs, what is it? Gary?
Gary Lamb, representing Maine Municipal. Only has permission to throw sharp objects at me when I say this, but not a compliment to say that parts of this document read like a comprehensive plan, municipal comprehensive plan, with non-committal words too prevalent. Gonna say you want to do something, do it. You know, support, identify, encourage. Get rid of those when we can and make an actionable urban subject there. Say what you're going to do, which I think 2 to 4 years from now will mean a whole lot more than what we actually do.
That's great. And over the break, what I'd love to do, Gary, is you and I can go through real quick in your least favorite application of non-committal words, let's find them. All right? That's great. Judy, and then I'll do it, Jen.
Judy East, Community Resilience Working Group. I would echo what Gary just said and add that I think we have avoided the frank statement that some of the infrastructure needs to move and that some of the stuff that we invest in with a 50-year life cycle, we need to really think about whether we rebuild in the same place that we built in the past, given the sea level rise.
Okay, so again, that's somewhere in here in the resilient sections
And the transportation section.
and the transportation section. You're looking for some language that more clearly articulates the need to get out of harm's way and not build things in harm's way. Okay. Great. I was gonna grab Ken and then I'll come over to Ben.
David, the issue of costs has come up several times this morning, not just energy costs, but costs generally and affordability generally. I would hope that in perhaps the introductory sections of the overall plan, we disabuse readers of the fantasy that we can do these things and there are costs, or we can just do business as usual and there aren't costs. Because there are going to be costs if we pursue business as usual. And so let's make sure that we note that for the reader.
Great. I'm gonna tuck that under the energy cost conversation and maybe those are all together in a similar little package of changes.
Although Ken's comments, I think, are broader. I think he's saying the cost of doing nothing is the.
Okay, great.
Bob Baines, Maine Officers Association. I think it would be helpful to look at this document, and there's so much in it, but what are the priorities of, you know, from where I come from, I think I have certain priorities, but and Hannah mentioned it's probably going to be discussed more in the executive summary, but I think it's really important to see just what are the priorities in each strategy.
So let's think about that. Great, that's helpful. Let's think about how to do that. Yep. Other things, Hannah.
So, and we can talk a little bit more about it after the break, but how we frame this plan and the narrative is something a lot of you have talked to us about. Because there's so many words. There's a lot of government speak. And how do we make sure that people understand what the priorities are of the council? And kind of the last time around, we sort of had these 4 big goals. And, you know, we've heard a lot about resilience and how do we make it clear that we understand the impacts people are feeling and how important we think it is to respond. So I just want to get out there the additional things Francis told me, and they're actually very much, I think, in line with what Dan brought up. He'd love to see a recommendation around all-income financing for weatherization and electrification incentive programs, since that's increasingly a barrier that contractors talk about. He'd love in the leading by example in public-owned buildings, especially schools, a focus on creating financing vehicles to help with upfront project costs. And honestly, I think a lot of that is about financial models for a variety of businesses and public institutions. The last thing he mentioned was ground source heat pumps and geothermal for residential and commercial buildings. Not a lot of mention of that in the plan. So I need to go back and look at the building section and energy section, but just mentioning that that's happening, it is happening in Maine, and it's happening in other states, and there are benefits and rebates for that, but we might want to emphasize that, so.
Right. Other things people feel strongly about, Kathleen?
Staying in the buildings world for a second, at the top of page 15, there's discussion about the zero energy home program from DOE, and the language in the document talks about that as a replacement program for existing mobile homes, and I just want to clarify whether that is an intentional choice. The DOE program, it could be new income qualified new homes as well. And so I just want to understand if that's intentional or
Okay, let's not solve that right now, but I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah. Other things that are, Matt, and then I'm gonna jump over to Melissa. Yep.
Yeah, just we're talking about topics, we'll just jump
Yeah.
in later. Okay. Yeah, I think on the building side, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the building code and really how the stretch code interacts with that and what we might do to make it easier to adopt codes so frequently. You can have one code.
Nice.
I'm happy to get into that more about it.
Yeah. Great. Melissa?
David, could I just add to that?
Yeah.
I totally agree with that statement, and it relates very much to the community rating system and the reasonableness of the target around enrollment in the community rating system.
Okay. Great. Melissa?
Yeah, Melissa, the ag representative to the council. I have two things that I think would be worth addressing later. One, I just feel like at the risk of going back to the framework conversation, I feel like strategy F is really long and this has and I know community resilience is such an overarching theme, but I feel like it just kind of goes in too many different directions. And I think that's also linked to materials management and our trash conversations. The meeting last time, and I'm seeing trash talked about in different sections. It's addressed in strategy E, methane emissions and food waste, as well as strategy F. I'm wondering, did we have a trash section and that got eliminated, or?
We didn't know what to do with trash, so we put it all over the place.
Yeah. I don't know, I just feel like that could be a way to kind of streamline the resilient communities and take some of the trash out of
Other places?
other places.
So make a section that is trash and materials management.
Yeah.
Like a bin. Yeah, like a bin. Very good. A container.
Circular.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. That's helpful. And do you want to jump right on that, Kathleen, or?
Well, just talking about the overall, there's so much in that section F, and I know there's also the Resilience Commission's report coming out, and it might be, maybe this is part of the introductory materials. What are all the other plans that are happening, the pathways, is this if you just read this document, will you get everything you need to know? Or what's the reading list of other places you might look for important guidance?
Got it. Okay,
Exactly.
thanks. Noel and then, or Dr. Ross?
She did, go ahead, please.
Okay, I think this goes back to, I think the last strategy, community and resilience, or where page 50. And I don't know if it belongs in this plan or not, but maybe I would appreciate the discussion. Strengthen public health monitoring, education, prevention. I would like to see stronger language, especially related to vector-borne diseases. Just knowing that our surveillance system here in Maine, because we lack the local infrastructure for public health, is actually quite limited. So I'd like to see stronger language, so not only are we monitoring it and being aware of it, could we help build that up? The other thing I wanted to talk about too is the impact of disasters related to emergency management and impact on health. I was hoping that maybe we could talk about, could we talk about the impact of disasters on health? Like when a disaster happens, we don't automatically do an assessment. We do an assessment on infrastructure, but we don't do the level of disaster impact on human health. And, this is something that's simple that we potentially can do if we add it to our systems of assessment and evaluation post-disasters.
On all issues of public health and mental health and all that.
Exactly, right, yeah, because there are tools that are available where you do rapid assessments on the humans themselves in the community, in addition to the infrastructure.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, Dr. Ball.
Two things. One, I think someone mentioned, can we prioritize some of the stuff that's in here? I think I want to echo that. And the second thing is, you mentioned several times, David, that, we'll get to some of the stuff when we meet again on the 31st. And I'm hoping that we'll get to most of this stuff today.
Today, yes.
And
My goal is the punch list is today. Targets are 31st.
got it. Thank you. And there's someone who has their hand up.
That's great. And Susie Arnold, is that an old hand or new hand?
I think it is a new hand, but she might take a minute.
She went on break.
Yep, nope, I'm here, home with a sick child, but I'm here.
Oh my God.
I wanted to just point out something on page 39. There's text in there about supporting Maine's farming, forestry, and fisheries industries and adapting to climate change. And later, I just wanted to call attention to the top two paragraphs there. In my opinion, I think the language misses the mark a little bit in terms of the scale. If you consider the lobster fishery has been plus or minus a couple of $100 million, so about so over the last couple of years, ranging from about $300 million to over $700 million. So averaging about a $500 million a year fishery recently. And it makes up about 75% of our fisheries value. We talk about fisheries being important culturally and economically to coastal communities. I would say that this fishery is really a lifeline for remote coastal communities. And so I think we need to strengthen some of the language in here. For example, it says Maine should focus climate adaptation and resilience efforts on the people and communities most dependent on those industries. Couldn't agree more. I think we also need to add and communities that lack other economic opportunities. And then later in the second paragraph on page 39, it talks about alternatives or solutions in increasing fisheries diversity. I think, however, there is a scale mismatch between what's being proposed there. Again, the lobster fishery being about a $500 million fishery per year, and the viable alternatives that they're proposing are just not in line with the economic implications of a decline in the lobster fishery. So I think we just need to tweak that language and give those two paragraphs a little bit more attention.
Thanks, Susie.
Yep.
Helpful. Pat?
Yes, just in the attempt to keep the climate action plan relevant to what's happening currently, there are some struggles with permitting for solar and wind projects that are going on right now. We have a statement, I think, in here that says improve state policies for permitting, siting, and procurement of clean energy transmission projects. That's good, but I think we need something that says we need a more comprehensive land use plan that matches our needs for renewable energy development and conservation and wildlife protection. All that needs to be done in a more thoughtful planning way. We're seeing struggles with it right now as we develop those rules. So I didn't know if in the plan we have that kind of discussion or acknowledgement, but I just wanted to flag it.
I'm glad you did it. Let's look in there and see what we have and if there's something else we want to do. Yeah.
Can I make Tom Avello talk? That's one thing.
Sure. Tom Avello, do you have some things you want to share in the name of
No, I mean, at the end, I think Pat's point is a good one. I wonder if that is in the land use section. When we talked about that several months ago, it was kind of a laundry list. And so, maybe that's an area where that statement gets captured.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm.
Do you want to make the other comments? Okay.
Okay. Great. Other things that we absolutely must talk about today, mission critical. We've got a pretty decent punch list here, but Kurt, were you jumping in? You felt, no, okay, that's good.
I think
Through the
people
hands.
brought this up in varying
Yeah.
degrees, I think, but the funding aspect, I think, is important, like, to really talk about how this will get done.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to that, it would be helpful to have some direction as we sort of almost write the implementation section, how to manage. We need money for everything and the prioritizing is a challenge, so, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, David, one more thing.
Yeah.
So late last week, the co-chairs, myself and Amanda, we submitted some comments on strategy E.
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, they're tweaks and clarifying. I don't know that there's anything new. There was not anything new in terms of new strategies or new language to kind of enhance strategies, but mostly kind of nibbling on the edges and clarifying what we see in the document that was sent out a week or so ago.
So why don't we if we have time today, we'll do a quick look at what some of those things would be, so everybody can know what that looks like. Okay, great.
And just to further Tom's point, I think some of the working groups, I've heard this from a couple of you have said, there was a 30-page report, a 25-page report, and I think we all, as a staff and co-chairs, tried to boil it down to be a document that God knows how many pages this will be. But I would just say there are things that were lost, and I think Tom and Amanda, and we heard this from IF&W as well. There was a lot of detail on what the conservation goal looks like and what the priorities are, and I think they felt like it was important to put those out in the climate plan. So I think we're open to all of those drafting comments. We just want to make sure the Climate Council, when you see some new things get added in the next week, that it wasn't like we just invented those. Those were sort of things that we've pulled back out of the working group reports that were kind of left on the cutting room is just important, but we just didn't put in every detail that was recommended.
And I don't think that's dissimilar from the first time around with
Yeah.
Maine won't wait. I mean, you have to make some kind of, kind of summary and you blend things together. But these documents they still live on the website. So if people want to go in and look at what did the working group do through its meetings, they can see that. But the idea isn't to change things, but just to kind of, streamline.
Sounds great. Judy, last word, and let's take a break.
I so struggled with exactly this point, with the mental health recommendations, with the community engagement recommendations, with the metrics recommendations. So the fact that the working groups all said the same thing and that our stuff is still there is encouraging, but I feel like I want to look at this. I just got back from being away. I literally just looked at all of this. I haven't read the public input. And I really glad we're meeting on the 31st because I feel like I need to just shut out the world and see if I can insert a few more things, not make it too much longer, but I really struggled with this.
Okay.
So.
All right, hopefully it's a very short list.
It'll be really tight language.
Okay. All right, let's take a break. I was gonna say 10 minutes, but let's be real. It's very hard to take a 10-minute break. So let's, at the top of the hour, let's come back. And we are gonna, in a efficient but powerful way, work our way through this punch list. And it's entirely fine to say, you know what, Molly and team, we trust you to get this right. This is our orientation. Let's move on to the next thing. Like, that's a perfectly good answer. And other things we're gonna need to really dig into and have a conversation. Let's be back at the top of the hour. Folks online, thanks for sticking with us. We'll take a break until 11 o'clock. And we'll be back and let's see how we do. We have, we're gonna do an hour until noon. We're gonna grab our lunch. We'll eat for just to get the lettuce chewing for 15 minutes and then do a working lunch. Yeah. All right, so we're gonna eat for 15 minutes and then keep eating while we finish our punch list and we'll stop it at 1. All right, so that's gonna be what we have 11 to 1. We'll break and give you a moment to grab lunch, sit down, enjoy a few bites before I start bugging you again.
You brought us lettuce sandwiches.
Lettuce sandwiches, that's all. You'll notice, folks online, thanks for hanging in there. We should have solved our mic problem, so hopefully this will be a better solution for you now. Okay, so our job now is to take the next roughly 2 hours with a 15-minute break to eat, or to begin eating, to work through this punch list. And I'm gonna give you just a flavor of the size of this punch list so we know how to calibrate our conversation topics. Give me 1 second. So it just shows on this one. And I can make it a little bigger if folks want to, but just to give you an idea, we're gonna have about 15 to 20 points. I put funding at the bottom, not because it's the least important, because I don't want it to eat the next 2 hours. So I'm gonna be working through this with you. And like I said, some of them could be great. Go fix it, Molly. We know what the instruction is. Others will be, we need a conversation, right? Because we have different views here. We need to try to figure out if we can reach some shared approaches.
David, is that list just from this morning?
That's right now. Yeah. That's from right now. What I didn't put in that list are some of the things around the targets, because I think what we're gonna do is take those comments back and prepare the meeting well on the 31st to really lean into the targets conversation on the 31st. So some of this stuff earlier in the morning around targets is not on this list, because I think it's better dealt with over this week, and then let's deal with it together on the 31st. All right?
Can I just raise one more thing, David? Sorry.
Of course.
I meant to say this earlier, but we did send you all last night a compendium of additional public comments we received. And some of them are very, very detailed on, I believe, biochar. And then there are some organizations sent us comments, some people across the state of Maine. And they do reflect some of what we heard and shared with you a couple weeks ago with all of the public comments, but there are points of emphasis. So I just want to be clear and transparent that we wanted to make sure that you knew those were in your inbox. You received them late last night, so if anybody has memorized them and read them all, I'm impressed. And I don't want to, I think some of them have been raised today about affordability, about specific strategies, so I think I can't characterize them all quickly, you know, a lot of comments about rail, comments about very specific things, so just want to make sure that everyone knows that's out there, and we as an office will, you know, some very small comments that we may be able to kind of reflect in our conversation today.
Yeah, and I think for sure, your co-chairs and the GoPIP team will be reading in detail those comments. And if there are things that we feel we need to bring to you next week, we will bring them to you. And we encourage all of you to read through them as well. Okay. All right, so let's start diving in and let's see how it feels to jump into this. And this first one is one of the most sensitive ones. And I think it's interesting for us to start with it because it's really important and it came up a lot. It's the energy cost one, right? We had heard this morning concerns about the cost of energy and are we driving up, for instance, electricity costs with a lot of these programs? Are we doing that? Are we not doing it? And we know that there are issues happening right now that make this sensitive. Melanie put on the table one way to deal with it. And that is on page 21. And this is gonna be kind of our modus operandi. And apologies folks online, if you hear a lot of rustling of papers, it's because everyone's diving to page 21 right now in your document. And I wonder, Molly, is it possible to post, if you have posted already or not, this document on the meeting page for this meeting?
Yes, we can absolutely do that.
Okay, if that's able to be done, that would be great. Then others could follow along online if they
Yeah,
don't
we've
have this
been
document.
sharing it online first.
Perfect. So maybe you can drop a link to it in the chat or something so folks online can, if you haven't already. Thanks. Okay, so this is where it's okay if we need a little reading time. But Melanie said, okay, one way to address what we're clearly hearing around the room today about concerns of will these policies increase energy burden, increase electricity costs, et cetera. One way is to add a sentence in here about the intent, right? And you had said something it's a priority for the Maine Climate Council that the implementation of these policies don't increase the cost of, you'd use the word electricity. Right?
Or energy.
Or any energy costs for Mainers, right? So that's one thing that could be said as an intent. I'm looking over, it diverged just a little bit too, because, there's language around all this, in the Pathways to 2040 and other things like that. So I'm curious, for those of you who have raised up some concerns, I'm looking at Noel and Matt, others who are around the table have raised concerns about the costs of energy and who's bearing those costs. Would a sentence like that here in our transition to clean energy strategy be helpful? Again, the sentence would read something along the lines of, it is a priority for this climate action plan or for this council, whatever, however you want to say it, that the policies implemented not increase the energy burdens or the energy costs for Mainers. Something like that?
Can I just, maybe it's a question to Dan and Ken and others who are on the energy working group. I think the first goal they had was to decrease energy burdens while transitioning to clean energy. And it is thinking more broadly about energy because we're transitioning from using multiple types of fuel to electricity. And I will say, as Matt Marks pointed out, we've actually seen incredible storm costs that are actually driving the majority of electricity increases right now. And there's obviously lots of other stuff happening with solar and other things that are happening in electricity proceedings. I think this strategy was attempting to really think about low-income people and their energy burden and how do we think about it broadly and think about setting metrics to manage that energy burden, if not lower it. I think what Melanie pointed out, and something we talked about in the last climate plan, is that this transition needs to be affordable, or else Maine people are gonna give up on us. But it's broader because we have a lot of factors happening with the impacts of climate change on our energy systems. We're transitioning from lots of different types of fuels to fewer fuel types, renewables, and that transition isn't always going to be perfect, but we need to ensure it's affordable. So I think we might think about how we can sort of think about broad affordability as a top priority of the Climate Council. Maybe think about adding a little bit more to this, versus just talking about one metric that we have a lot of control over, but not 100%. Again, so.
I really appreciate what Hannah said, because that's where I would go as well. And because right now, the way it reads, it feels like we're going to achieve it at any cost. And I think we should be thoughtful about that. And this is not about wanting to achieve this at any cost. We should keep it affordable. We should make this a viable thing. And that is not reflected. So if you could actually name and articulate it the way Hannah just did, I think would be really helpful.
Great. Kathleen and then Pat.
I think one of the tricky things that we have to navigate here too is that we're talking about affordability. If we have to look at the affordability of the clean energy transition in the future compared to business as usual in the future. Neither current, both may be more expensive than right now. And that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to freeze energy rates in time, because we will continue to have storm damages and we will continue to have things that are out of our control. So I just want to be careful that it doesn't seem like a promise that the Climate Council will never, you will never pay more than you're paying right now, because I'm not confident that that's a promise we can keep.
And storm damages.
And that's why I like what Hannah said versus what Melanie had suggested, because that was more to the lines of, it was getting to the same thing. But I think the nuance there is what you're clarifying, Kathleen. And I think that's coming through.
Noel, could you repeat what you heard Hannah say? This is a good exercise. Like what is it you heard her say that resonated?
I think what resonated with me is that we talk about affordability being a priority in how we build this out, right? And without causing undue burden, I think is what I also, and now I'm putting words in Hannah's mouth, but that is what we're getting to. Because going back to net energy billing, the costs were being split by all ratepayers, and for low-income ratepayers, even adding $5, $7 more was just too much, right? And so, and one of my comments to the survey was, when we talk about incentives, right, to incentivize, businesses to kind of do more of this, who's paying for that incentive, right? Is it on the backs of ratepayers again, and other consumers? So being able to think about that and getting to affordability without causing undue burden, I think would be helpful.
Great. So, Pat?
Yeah, I think I'm always looking at it from the manufacturing side, but it's the same for our citizens. We're in a competitive environment, and so we're really pro wind power and solar power on a grid scale because we can get that at an economical rate. It has been the net energy billing pieces that the policy didn't match up quite right. And that's what's been part of the reason for, and a big part of the reason for some of the cost overruns and stranded costs. So I think my message is let's learn quickly and let's keep, there are ways to do this, but we're gonna lose the population if we don't differentiate and start to talk about economical power, cost-effective power, because it's there and we can find it. But so I think that message is what I'm looking for to reassure the manufacturing community that we're not going to have escalating costs that'll make you non-competitive and move you to other states.
Great. Okay. So given that, what I'm hearing is there's some line that needs to find its way very prominently into this strategy and the overall Maine climate plan. It says something along the lines of affordability of energy for Maine homes and businesses is a priority for this climate plan and must remain a priority as the plan is implemented. Right? So you make a statement that affordability is crucial. Right? Then you need to look at here and say, okay, strategy C, are all these things helpful with that? Right? And when you look at this, we've got strategy 1 is all about decreasing energy burdens and the way you do that. Strategy 2 is all about how you do cost-effective build out of clean energy. And strategy 3 is how you lower the costs of the grid and through effective demand management and other things like that. So in theory, all 3 of the pieces of strategy C align with the idea of affordability. Right? I'm just doing that as a quick gut check. So again, just testing if this document has a clear sentence along the lines of what I just read off, and then we just stick our noses into the detail here for a second and be like, oh yeah, the first one's about decreasing energy burdens in the energy transition. The second one is about how do we do cost-effective build out of clean energy and a lot of the stuff. And then the third one is about saving costs on the electric grid through innovative load management, demand management, all that kind of good stuff. Ken?
If you're a friendly amendment, I'd suggest a statement like you just read in the introduction of the whole report. And in the lead-in section of strategy C, and then citing the 3, the fourth one is workforce issues. So citing the 3 strategies as evidence of the importance and the fact that the council is keeping affordability in mind, and then go into the rest of the chapter C.
Right. Does that make sense for folks?
That belongs before number 1 in strategy C.
Yes.
David, I was going to say that I think I agree with Ken. You can see in the 3rd and 4th paragraphs that's really what was attempted to be getting at. I think, why are we having this challenge of affordability? Many reasons, but large part to global energy markets and our reliance on natural gas to produce our electricity. Therefore, moving to clean energy, but have to do it affordably. So I think we could strengthen that, maybe that 4th paragraph on page 20, and put others on if it goes up front. I also think not in here is necessarily the word volatility, and I think that goes hand in hand with energy burden is, reducing the price swings that many people have experienced, whether week to week or month to month or year to year, depending on the fuel source. So I think having the word volatility included with affordability would be great.
Great.
Or predictability. The opposite.
Right.
Yeah.
Reducing volatility, increasing predictability.
Yeah.
Okay.
As long as it's not predictably volatile, that's what.
I'm thinking that.
Ivan, and then Chris, yeah?
Yeah, I just want to underscore the strong, because this is only a small passage that leads into a lot of government speak discussion of affordability. The stronger the language, the better to capture people's attention. I like when the whole started with, this is not goals at all costs, because that's the way people that don't like the plan refer, it's planned to do this at all costs and we're paying the price. And so the stronger we can make that point up front, the better.
Great, love it. Chris, and then let's see if we can close this and move on to the next bullet.
Yeah, in terms of affordability, I don't know if this is gonna just muddy the waters a bit more, but I think what's not getting focused on is how some of these efforts are going to reduce the cost of living in other areas of people's lives that is not specific to the energy burden. And that's, for example, with improving indoor air quality. That's gonna be potentially less of a burden on pain care, or where people are investing in their homes, doing preventative maintenance of their homes. So there are additional savings outside of the energy world that should be included in that, so.
Okay.
Can I just build on that for 1 second?
Yeah.
I think frequently in these calculations, people tend to focus on, oh no, my electricity is going up, totally forgetting they're not gonna be getting those $1,000 a month fuel bills.
Yeah.
So it's like they forget that they're also just cutting out this whole other aspect of their expenses.
Oh, and that's, if the more we can stress that in this document, the better, right?
Maybe it's just as simple as having like a little sidebar quote, because when in the
Yeah.
gussying up of, the beautification of the report in general, be easy to pull that from, like we switch to heat pumps or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So in the interest of trying to address these things efficiently, what do I have in my notes right now? I have, in the overall intro to this document and to strategy C, have a phrase that's as plain language as possible. That says something like the affordability of energy for Maine homes and businesses is a priority for this climate plan and must remain a priority as the plan is implemented. And we can say the 4 recommendations under strategy C are evidence that, what you were trying to say, Dan, evidence that this has been a priority because they're blah, 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 blah. Great, that's one thing. Second thing, can strengthen the 4th paragraph on page 20, get that language a little bit better. Third thing, we can add in the importance of reducing volatility and increasing predictability. And then finally, somewhere in this document, we can also make reference to other types of benefits that come from this kind of transition, whether it's, better health issues from better indoor air quality, et cetera, et cetera. So we can add that in somewhere to get at that. So those are 4 ways to address this really important issue. Does that seem workable for folks? Yeah, Pat, last word?
Just the word business community doesn't show up in any of that.
Maine, I said affordability for Maine homes and businesses.
Okay, good, thank you.
Excellent. Got it. Okay. Well done. All right. Related to this is a comment about, in the overall document, can we be clearer about the costs of business as usual? So if we're going to talk about costs and things like that, can we be clearer? And I'm just curious, is that enough instruction, and then let Molly and team go figure out how to do that? Do folks want to give sort of 60-second of instruction about how you might want to see that happen? About being clear of the costs of business as usual when we talk about costs in this plan? Yep.
I'm not sure if it's feasible to totally predict both of those sides of the coin, but I think that by now we probably do have some examples of where someone did change a culvert into a much stronger bridge and then it survived the next storm, you know what I mean? So maybe it's we saw that in our meeting, it was in January, February, or February, when our compatriots from Vermont came over and gave us some examples of things that they did after Irene that then survived last summer's storms. So if it's maybe just a few examples without trying to calculate these two, huge figures. Two different directions, choose your own adventure in the future.
Right, and we have examples right here in Maine with
Yep.
Joyce's culverts,
Yep.
right? We'll sign them, Joyce. Joyce's culverts that did withstand the Armageddon flooding in western Maine, right?
I have it over here.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that not all of those sort of in EPA speak, it would be counterfactual examples are quantifiable, a lot are not. So a narrative that speaks to the subjective indirect costs, if you don't reduce greenhouse gases, these certain things change, but then there's air pollution impacts on human health, and there's consequences for insurance and all the stuff that gets exacerbated. So alluding to that, and some analyses that have been done, I was on a panel that evaluated the Clean Air Act, and came up with quantitatively $1 in 1990 saved American public $30, big error bars. And then on top of that were all these sort of contingencies that also had real costs. So some language that just points to it's a lot.
Right.
And I just want to emphasize, when we did the climate plan in 2020, we commissioned a pretty significant and complicated report on the cost of inaction, and they're sort of long-term. And I think we had it as part of the kind of lead into the climate plan. We had a whole science kind of where we are with climate. So I think we can ensure that those two pieces are in the leading, because I do think taking no action, whether it's on resilience or reducing emissions, has impact. So we can try to speak again to what those are.
Right.
And I'll just add to that, that since then, the cost of doing nothing in terms of resilience has gone up. It's not just the cost of the bridges and the culverts, it's the cost of the disruption of life surrounding.
Yeah,
You can't
if
go
your
from
power's
place
out
to
for
the-
6 days or you can't get to work, it's a problem,
Right. Okay, that sounds like great instruction. Are we confident that the writing team will be able to take that and run with it? Okay, super. Next thing. Feels like too many non-committal words and verbs. All right, Gary. All right, get a list. Okay. What about adjectives?
Any comments on adjectives?
That's right, no adjective and
Designed to generate lots of.
You actually want me to read these?
I'm interested if you want to shout out just a few.
Okay.
Yeah.
Enhance, cooperate, investigate, encourage, support, identify, help. Continue to participate, increase, ensure, focus on, promote, guide, and strengthen.
Okay, so those are your least favorite expressions. So here's my thought. Would it be a good instruction? Yes. Dear Molly, is it possible to do a quick read through over the next few days, right? And pick out some of those least favorite phrases. Sometimes they're used intentionally, right? Sometimes they could be swapped out for something a little stronger. So what if we did a little effort there and we come back to you, maybe even just over email, and say, hey, guess what? We swapped out 10 examples on pages, check them out. That sound good?
We could also contribute to that.
Some staff would help you with that.
Yeah.
Sure sounds pretty strong.
David, one thought there, and I think Gary might even agree with this. When one of those verbs is accompanied by metrics, and here's how we're going to measure this, that verb can probably be forgiven.
Yeah.
And Molly probably needn't change it, but it's the ones that have no metric, that have no, measurability that I find particularly bothersome.
Context is important.
Yeah.
And And I do think a couple people, I mean, Dan made the point about the finance stuff. You're just trying to, there are some places where we say, oh, we're gonna try, and I think we either, if it's so lame, should we even bother, or should we put a more clear actionable date on when something's going to happen? So it's not just floating out there as try as hard as you can.
Guys, everyone's a winner.
Well,
Okay.
can I say something? Yeah. I mean, there are some things that we as a state government don't control. And you are assigning tasks to people who haven't agreed to do them. Right. And so I think we do have to be a little bit sensitive to that.
And or reframe that
Yeah.
particular thing to what is the
Yeah.
right role, right, for the actor that's the intent, which would be DOT or somebody.
Yeah.
Right? You can take steps even though you're not in control. Noel, then let's move on.
I think the bottom line, the broad ask is that we be more overt in our goals and what we're asking or suggesting we're going to do, and be more stronger in our use of words.
Love it, okay. All right, let's see how far the writing team can get with that. All right, the next bullet I have here is, let's be more transparent about the fact that some infrastructure is gonna need to move out of harm's way, and that we really shouldn't be building infrastructure in areas where it's predictably in harm's way. Now, this is something where it would be really helpful to actually go to a page and see what's on the page now and what should be on the page. So Judy, I'm gonna ask your help with that, because those are areas where I don't have it as top of mind. But if we all turn to the top of strategy F, which is page 41, that's where this should happen, right?
Well, the place where I first thought of it was actually on page 8 to 9.
Page 8 to 9, okay.
And I completely agree with identifying and strengthening critical vulnerable transportation infrastructure. But there are bridges and approaches that serve peninsulas that are going to be underwater, those peninsulas. So at what point do you say, we're not going to build a bridge to nowhere, to use that old phrase, given how much it costs to install that infrastructure in the first place? And then the same applies to sewage treatment facilities that are so vulnerable, often by definition, because of where we've located them. When do you decide you're not going to armor it, you're going to move it? And we haven't stepped up to how hard those conversations are in what I've read. And I have to admit, I looked at this really fast yesterday afternoon and last night. So maybe that language is in here, but I feel like maybe we don't do that until 2028. I don't know. Go ahead, Joyce.
I would say there's a significant work that DOT has been undergoing on a sea level rise model with NOAA maps, the very latest NOAA LiDAR maps with Woods Hole Consulting. And so that will be basically an interactive map where you can see inundation depths and length of inundation. And so I think that won't be here till next year, but that's going to be the game changer in terms of us having that conversation. Because we are at DOT beginning to have some of those conversations. I can tell you it never goes well.
No.
People aren't ready for it. They don't believe us. It's really tough. Communities are split in how they want to have these conversations, frankly. And I keep saying I don't think DOT should be the first state agency out there having the conversation, frankly. But I think we are doing a lot because we share that sentiment. You know, for us, I could put a bridge high and dry, but if the whole road is underwater for a week, we really haven't done anything to help. So I think that is very much a big part of our conversation. I don't have a problem having some language in here for doing it. But I just would say I think in 4 years, we will have that model. We will know more than we know more today.
Can I just propose, I think between what you both have said, I think we actually added this. We
Yeah.
sort of felt like the resilient transportation thing wasn't in the climate plans, we sort of added this because it's something that is such an active area in which state and communities are working on, so we added this. We could add something like use modeling to consider relocation of critical infrastructure, you know, at least starting to have, because I will just say, Judy, I don't think we disagree with you. Same time, some of the roads that people live at the end of, abandoning that road on a peninsula may or may not ever be an option, or at least easily be an option. So I do think we need to start using the modeling, to consider the options versus stop, you know, putting in the climate plan, we're gonna stop funding roads where.
Yeah,
live
and
at the
I
end of
want to
them.
be clear that I'm not saying it as starkly as that, more that we had a lot of conversations in the resilience work group around how critical it is to have excellent facilitation in having these community conversations around at what point do we make these decisions? And I didn't necessarily see that later on, but again, I read this super fast last night.
So let me point then, so it sounds like there could be some language in that page 8 to 9 with the resilient transportation of like use modeling to help consider options for infrastructure that is, you know, at high risk, et cetera. It is also on page 44 at the top under the first sort of recommendation under the strategy. I'm not sure. Under the increased local capacity for climate resilience, if you look at the 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet down, it does talk about developing tools to help communities and people, quote, get out of harm's way, right? And that's a signal to how do we work with communities constructively on these difficult conversations, because that's my understanding what that means. So I think it's there in that way, whether it's there totally the way you might want, Judy, I don't know. But I'll just point to it being there.
Yeah, maybe adding proactively with long-term planning could actually make a difference there. I thought that's what Judy was getting to in terms of like, when do we start planning? When do we start preparing? Not only from the infrastructural perspective, but also having those community conversations and difficult conversations.
Right, so even in that same bullet, that same recommendation about develop tools or actions, develop tools to help communities, people get out of harm's way through long-term planning, that kind of language would be helpful.
Proactively.
Long-term is critical, but it's just the engagement.
Yeah.
The skilled facilitation, and I guess in the second paragraph, it's there. I don't know, there was so much depth to those conversations, it's hard to see it squished down, but I think it's there. I'll look at it again and if there's any tweaking, suggest it.
Got it, okay.
Carl
Anything
had a
else?
comment too.
Okay, Carl, yeah.
Yeah, just kind of on the resilience theme, it's unclear to me how this document jives with the Resilience Commission.
Okay.
And that it was created at the same time we were working on this document. It was obviously in a response to what happened last fall and winter. It feels to me that is one of the major outcomes of this document is the Resilience Commission, and it's just not highlighted up front. And I think that if it was, then I think that also starts to set the, you know, what are the 3 priorities coming out of this document that everyone's gonna say, you know, this document did, you know, the 3 things that we want to do with this document are X, Y, and Z. I think resilience is one of them. It's already got a governor's commission on it. I think somewhere needs to be weaved in here to be brought forward.
Right, and that you're thinking more like way up top to say, as you're talking about really what this whole climate action plan is trying to do.
Right.
Build resilience in the state of Maine is one of it, as evidenced by a whole separate commission that is developing detailed level.
Yeah, I mean, that just, it feels like that's an outcome that was in part because of this conversation that we'd already been going on. But it just also, there are times when you can have a climate council, then there's a time when you need a commission to be very responsive, like in the moment, and it seems like that's what the Resilience Commission is trying to do. I also just struggle with the specificity of this document or the lack thereof. And And I don't know the answer to that because within the working group documents, there's more specificity here that you'd never be able to put in here.
Yeah.
And so I think you're always gonna be that push and pull of, do you wanna, you mentioned fisheries, but do you wanna mention specific fisheries? You mentioned resilience, but do you wanna mention specific resilience or pull that out?
I was talking at the break with someone over this, and I think, Carl, you bring up a great point, and one of the things we talked about over the break, which was, what if, as you're talking about the content of this plan, you make specific reference to greater detail in the working group documents and you link it right in the plan?
Yeah.
And so you could make it easier on the reader to be like, oh, there's more detail somewhere, it's in the working group document. And you could really like drive people to that detail if they want it. Because I think you make a great point, I think Tom Bell was making the same point, it's like, we're gonna crush this plan if we take the dozens and dozens of pages of each working group document and put it in here, like it will sink, right? So how do we distill in here and then provide very easy link back to where there's more detail? Sound good? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's key. I mean, a lot of people will be reading this on paper, but most people will probably be reading it online and can go directly to what they're interested in. And those links and those details will be key for people to get the information out.
I got a question on,
Yeah.
but are the working is this document a synthesis with decisions, prioritization of the guiding document? Or is the guiding document just further clarification of the rules here? I mean, I kind of approached it as we needed to bring prioritization to all the recommendations. And so I don't think it's easily transported back to that document. Am I making sense here?
I mean, I will actually say, Pat, I think you're right in that, for example, coastal and marine or natural working lands, there's a lot more detail that we didn't disagree with. It's sort of like, if you want to know the detail on what we should be monitoring in fisheries, like go read it here. That being said, it is the role of the Climate Council to decide which of the strategies coming out of the working group we agree and disagree with and we want to prioritize. I will say what we brought you is primarily the strategies of the working groups with emphasis on things that we've heard from folks over the course of the last year and a half. I don't think there's anything that we're like, no, but I mean, honestly, that was what we're here to talk about today, is like clearly this is still a pretty weighty thing. There are a lot of strategies. Some people might argue too many strategies, but I think that is where like the messaging / our debate, is there anything you don't like and you want to take out? I think there are things that we've in our conversations even tweaked from when they came from the working groups to make them more specific or to change them slightly because we didn't agree with exactly how they came in.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. I mean, my experience is those working documents surface in the legislative arena more so than the consolidated plan that we've all spent time really synthesizing and wordsmithing. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's
I feel like both things are true in the sense of that you as a climate council have a responsibility to make sure that this document reflects the core interest concerns and you're comfortable with having this document see the light of day. At the same time, the working groups did a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot of detail in there. It's not that you as a climate council sign off on all that detail. You can just say the working groups had a more detailed look at this. So both things can be true of like, you are in charge of this, Okay. All right, so just to summarize then on these points, on the one thing, we can do a better job of linking to detail, and the way we reference that's important to Pat's point, but the way we reference the detail of the working group process that can provide another layer of information and thought. Then on the specific things about getting out of harm's way, we can do some stuff in the transportation part, which is pages 8 and 9, and add a sentence in there about using modeling to consider options for infrastructure that has unique vulnerabilities or whatever, how you want to frame it. And then on page 44, where we're talking about the community resilience stuff, we can talk more, make sure that we make some references about proactive, long-term planning, facilitated dialogue, that kind of stuff, right? Make sure that's coming out loudly. All right?
And the commission, reference to the commission. as
And
well.
referencing the commission, where I put that somewhere else, I can't remember where. But I wrote it down, it's in here somewhere, but yes, referencing the, and resilience overall being important and early in the document, using a reference to the commission to highlight the importance of resilience as a priority.
There's slight nuance, and again, others might disagree, and I'd like to hear that. I think referencing to the commission in the context of the resilience piece here might be more relevant than overall, because not all of it may be directly related. It is connected, but not as directly as some of the resilience goals that have been articulated here, so. But I could be wrong.
And well, I think you're right, Noel. I mean, I definitely think we sort of have a lot of narratives that's gonna be added to this plan. We have pictures and quotes and status things, but talking about the commission itself and what it's coming up with will include some detail on that in the resilience section. I would say we've talked a lot about themes, and there is a theme of just the urgency of resilience in the face of these storms. I mean, we've talked about the cost of inaction, we've talked about affordability. I think we'll try to think about how to put those themes up front and see what we can even share with you next week, so you can see if you agree with how we're framing this overall plan. Since there's so much in here, we want to kind of focus on the high points that might be threaded throughout.
And that's a great pivot to the next point, which is, hey, what are the priorities? Can we name them? How do we frame this up front? Right? And so Anna just did that with this, which is the urgency of resilience in helping Maine prepare, right, and recover. So that's clearly going to be one theme up top. I'm curious, yeah, Bob, do you want to say something about that?
Well, I just want to build on that because that's where we are. I mean, Carl talking about the commission. The priority of the fishing community is infrastructure. Currently, it's infrastructure. Going through what we went through last winter, we lost so much of that infrastructure. Some of it's being built back, some of it isn't being built back. I think, and Ken and I had this conversation, Molly touched upon it. In the executive summary, I think it's going to be really highlighted that this is a priority. And using the commission as an example, that the state has already started working on this. But, you know, there's a lot of other good stuff in here talking about infrastructure on page 49, but I think somehow it can be highlighted and brought to the attention. There's so many things and people have concerns about this plan, and it's very important to many people. The working waterfront, the coastal communities is a big part of this state. And I think it just needs to be right out there in front.
Great, so that's the kind of thing that can be lifted up at a very sort of high level for a good communication point. And I wonder, Hannah and Melanie, as you're thinking about this and thinking back to the last plan, you know, there's like big goals, but is there a way to highlight that kind of stuff? Just sort of more, you know, messaging wise, to say what you will find in this plan, right, is an urgency on resilience and rebuilding and infrastructure, What you'll find in this plan is about the affordability of right?
Yeah, I
So,
mean, and none of us are holding our plans from last time around.
yeah,
But I think if you looked at that, we did do that, and I think it will be different this time. We can try to bring that back to you in a week so you can see how we're sort of framing those themes. But I mean, I'd love to know, are there other themes we should highlight?
anyone want to shout out a theme? Like I just shouted out affordability of energy in the transition, right? There may be some other things people want to shout out about, like, oh, don't forget this is a really big theme.
I think going back to what Jess said, Judy said, and maybe what Melanie and Hannah did too earlier, I think is talking about protecting Maine, right? All this work is about ultimately protecting Maine in the future from things that are coming our way that we know will be coming our way. And speaking to that directly, I think is, you guys kind of mentioned something to Maine's character, like if we don't do something, inaction is also bad. And that's going to alter who we are as Mainers and as Maine as a state, right? And so that's what I was hearing, and I think maybe talking about that could be one aspect of it, overall high level.
That sound good, folks? Yeah. Anything else, folks?
Make one observation.
Yeah,
Since we looked at this in September,
25th.
what I've seen is a really, really good adjustment of jargony language into very direct language. So I mean, I just also want to observe that because I think that it really made a big difference. So I just, especially Molly and Maggie, I know you guys, well, Sarah, all of you.
Yeah.
It's really,
Saying that,
really
Judy.
good.
It's good to hear that because it was a clear message from you all and clearly it was heard. And they had the ability to fix it.
And we'll keep going. We hear Gary, we'll keep going. We've not stopped.
Okay, so on priorities,
David,
yeah, where am I?
Just another thing that I think is done really well in here and worth pulling out in that introductory material as one of the top priorities is the recognition that this council has a very clear statutory responsibility, right? And that we have to hit those emissions reduction targets. That's non-negotiable. And people and businesses experience the climate crisis not just as an emissions number, and they experience it along with a whole bunch of other things. And so there's a lot in here that speaks to the daily lived experience of being a person at this moment in history. And I think we do a really good job here of trying to address those things while keeping those emissions reductions targets top and all of those metrics top of mind. And I think it's worth acknowledging upfront, that's hard.
Right.
And that you're gonna look, there may be people who are looking for things in this plan that they're not gonna see. And that's okay, and that's why there are a million other processes underway, but just, this is not gonna solve everything. And that doesn't mean we're not trying to solve everything.
Right. Right, and that connection between sort of like hard statutory responsibility and speaking to people's lives, the lives, you know, the reality of businesses and people across the state. I think that's gotta be the balance of this. Okay. All right, shall we move on?
David, I just was gonna say on themes, and I think it's really important to think about the economic opportunity that comes with this plan as well. I mean, the law that created this is called the Act to Promote Clean Energy Jobs and Establish the Climate Council, right? So it's about the kind of statutory requirements, but how are we also strengthening our economy at the same time? And that was before we had the federal, you know, opportunities. So I think that's a theme to include.
Excellent. Okay.
So I was not gonna say that, but I've been scribbling here trying to say themes, and when you just said that, Dan. Effective, affordable, equitable, forward-thinking, and opportunity. If you had that as a footnote on every page, or something that expands it, or had a diagram or something that was repeated thematically, anyway.
Some people might love that.
What did you say again?
Some people might hate it.
What did I say? Effective, affordable, equitable, opportunity, and forward-thinking.
So we're all those things.
Yeah, I know.
Awesome, okay.
That was a lot of adjectives.
Yeah, well.
So, there was a comment about financing for weatherization and sort of thinking about that from all income. I think that was what you transmitted from Francis. I wasn't quite sure what Francis was thinking. We have a lot on weatherization. We have a target around low and income houses for weatherization.
I think what Francis is getting at is actually closer to what Dan spoke to, was that there are households, businesses, and other entities that to access federal opportunities, especially the IRS opportunities, there needs to be more advanced financing opportunities. Efficiency Maine is working on that for, I would say, largely for consumers. I don't want to speak for Michael, but I think there's a lot more to be done in this space. And so I think Francis was speaking to one component of it. He mentioned schools, but I think Dan's idea of a more aggressive and urgent plan for creative finance options that utilize federal capital, private capital to help people take actions, I think that I don't know, Dan, I don't wanna speak to what you're saying, but I think that is something we like that idea.
So, okay, so on this, should we just talk about that in a second when we get down to the funding and financing thing? Because essentially we're talking about that next piece, which was financing vehicles to help with upfront costs, that kind of stuff. Okay, so let me just paste that down below and we'll,
Dan did mention page 47, we have study the feasibility of a resilience bank and
Yeah.
other finance tools. I think he's saying study other finance things and come up with a plan sooner.
Yeah, the scope of the study should be broader and the urgency should be greater and the report back should be more concrete, like we want options, we don't just want the feasibility of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is the right time or if I should bring it up later, but going back to what Michael brought up as well, and like when we have these goals of 50,000 households or doing 1,600, houses, weatherizing so many houses, 16,000. How is that being funded? Because if Maine State Housing Authority is expected to kind of really make that happen or be responsible for it some way, there's no funding for it. So, right, so where is, and I don't know if this is the right time, it's all falls together, right?
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so let's put a pause on that, because that's gonna take more than the 5 minutes we have before we grab lunch. Because I do wanna have that bigger conversation around funding and how we have things in the report that are pointing to different pathways towards funding.
Can
Okay,
I just ask, does anybody disagree with this idea of
yeah,
of us
But maybe
putting
that- it's
something
that
more
easy.
clear about, this is more pursuing finance options? Doesn't strike me as overly controversial. It could be a lot of work, but
Would be great, yeah.
And would it also be like sustainable finance option? Just wanna make sure.
right, so maybe it's easier than I'm thinking, right? Maybe it's as straightforward as saying, you know what? It's not clear enough yet in this plan that we're gonna need to, in the sort of analogy of playing the organ, pull out all the stops, right? Where we're gonna need thoughtful financing options that attract private capital, that get over the initial hump of upfront costs. We're gonna need philanthropic dollars that help drive certain solution spaces, right? We're gonna need a bunch of this, and we don't really say it as clearly as we should right now. Right? Maybe that's as clear as that's what we need, and now Molly and company and others who wanna chime in can find a way to get that in here. Yeah, Molly?
Deborah Elwood, I think, wanted to chime in.
Oh, great, thank you. Deb?
I don't know if this is the right time, so you can stop me, David, if it isn't. It was a kind of a new suggestion related to the executive summary. I can talk about it after lunch. It's pretty simple, but don't mean to interrupt the flow of thought right here.
Can you hold it just for a second, because I wanna see if we're actually done with this sort of funding call that was really important.
well, I would only say I'm more responding to financing, bringing in other types of capital.
Yeah.
I think that Dr. Va and Noel, I think there's no perfect solution to how we pay for everything in this plan. And I do think how we discuss long-term sustainability of funding, for example, for land conservation or for working waterfront. Private capital and other things could be part of the solution, but long-term funding of everything, I don't think we've totally neatly tied that up in a bow, but I'm not necessarily saying there's gonna be any good solution other than trying to lay out our priorities.
Yeah. Okay, so but what I am writing down here, and it's not super pretty just yet, but I'll fix it up when we start lunch, is on this issue of funding, there is a need in this document to say more clearly that we're gonna need to attract different kinds of funding and financing mechanisms, right? That's gonna require working proactively on mechanisms that bring in private sector dollars, right? And that's gonna require helping philanthropic dollars find their way into a solution. And it's gonna need to be creative on the public financing side of things and adapt to the ebbs and flows of federal money or whatever is available, right? So somewhere in this document, we need to say that a little more clearly and then point to potential things we're talking about, whether it's the resilience bank or something else. And I know the green bank came up in the housing. I can't remember if it ended up in the document or not, but I don't know where that's gonna go in the document maybe Molly has some vision where it might show up. But what I'm taking from this conversation is get it in there, be explicit, it's a thing. Right?
Speaking of explicit, and maybe it was implicit in what you were saying, you didn't mention state. You know, the state as an entity, you mentioned federal funding, philanthropic funding. But I think mentioning the state and the legislature too, I think would be important.
Yeah. Thank you.
David, listen to the recording, because I think you said that extremely well.
Okay.
Deborah
Recording, right?
had her thumbs up too. She
Okay.
was giving up.
Okay.
Can I just add to?
Yeah.
I think Hannah explained it, but I just wanna, I guess, tease it out and make sure we're, at least I'm being clear on what I would like to see is, I don't know whose jurisdiction this falls under, but having people that are way smarter than me on finance actually take a serious look at this and see what instruments or organizations can be created, how they would need to be created, whether it's a statute or, you know, and report back to us on kind of, these are the menu of options that we have available.
I like that.
So the New England Environmental Environmental Finance Center representatives were on the Resilience Working Group, and in our recommendations, I think you've got that expertise, and there's some detail in there that you can draw on.
Okay. I really like that. And it's a good moment for us to pause maybe and grab some lunch. We have some stuff to work through, but as you've seen, we've been systematically working through it. And so I think we can do this, folks, today, knock on wood. But what I'd love to do now is take a break. We grab some lunch. We spend 10-15 minutes just talking and eating. And then I'll gather us again a little bit before 1:15, and we'll get going again on this list. We may turn off the video in the room, so the people online don't need to see us stuffing our faces, but we'll see how we artfully do that. But let's take a break. There's lunch over here on the side. Grab a lunch, come sit down, chat, and in about 12 minutes, somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes, I'll get us going again, see if we can get through this lunch.
How many participants have we got?
Welcome back, online folks. We're gonna keep the camera with the version you see right now, which won't be this like owl that comes shooting into your face while you're eating your cookie or otherwise munching. So online folks, you're gonna have a little less precise video for a little while until we finish up eating in this process. We can switch over to owl once we're done munching. Okay, we made great progress before this quick break. We have a few things left to do. And let's see how far we can get. I just noticed the clock. Yikes. Okay. So next up. The next up was a mention that ground source heat pumps and geothermal is not clearly mentioned or shouted out in this plan. That was a comment, Francis, as well. From our buildings folks, Kathleen, Michael, and other, is there any way that could be easily slipped in so that it's not deliberately left out? It's more, just a mention. You think, Kathleen? Not to put you on the spot, but.
Yeah, we did spend some time talking about that as a working group, but not so much time that I would feel comfortable making it a recommendation.
Yeah.
But what I can do is spend some more time with what's here and identify a few places that we might be able to add some language. And Francis, wherever you are, we can talk about that.
Great. Everyone comfortable? Kathleen, Michael, and the other buildings folks, take a look at where it's possible to mention that so it doesn't feel abandoned in this plan. Any concerns with that? Right. Okay.
Michael's right there.
Were you guys joining, Michael?
To double check, are you talking about geothermal, that comment, or something else?
Geothermal, ground source heat pumps and geothermal was the comment, yeah. Again, Kathleen's suggestion was, it's not about making a recommendation, it's about making sure that it's not so conspicuously absent, people draw conclusions from that.
Yeah, we consider geothermal heat pumps to be a form of heat pumps. So for all of our programs, when we say heat pumps, we would include geothermal. And I would respectfully say that it was not a topic of a lot of conversation in our work group. It did get mentioned, but I would not characterize it as having a lot of discussion, but there's no problem referencing it in the chapter.
Thanks, Michael. All right, good on that? Okay. Sticking with building stuff, this is a good one. I'll let Matt Marks finish chewing for a second here. Building stretch codes. This is something, Matt, that you flagged. And then there's a little conversation about ways that this section around code, which is for everyone's reference, is page 15. It's the third recommendation under the building strategy. Matt and Kathleen and Michael, unfortunately, you were not there to be part of this right now over break. We're talking about some ways, some suggested changes to that suite of actions under building codes. So maybe I'll just turn it over to you, Matt and or Kathleen, if you want to say a few things of what's on your mind about that.
Yeah, so one of the issues is that the stretch code, well, the ideal thing is for us all to have the same statewide building code. I mean, that's the goal. If that were to happen, it makes it easier for construction and design, and it helps with costs and everything else. So our thought is that if we were to actually get in a place where we can be adopting the codes in the current cycle, not a cycle behind, and in addition, have a resource for a statewide building inspector like we do for plumbing and electrical, that will have a greater impact than the stretch code, which has limited use, is difficult for most towns to try to interpret. It's a very thick book, you've looked at that before. But the other piece here is that it makes it universal. Now, if you look at the codes between 2009 and the 2021 code, there is significant energy savings difference, but there is less difference between 2015 and 2021. And so we will be making more frequent incremental changes, which I think will be better for the design and construction community and also code enforcement if we're able to make that happen. And so my thought is that then makes it a lot easier to forego the stretch code and just be on a regular code update where the state is universal. So from our perspective, it'd be terrific.
And Matt, can you just clarify the stretch code for the few towns in Maine who have a stretch code? It's not a different code, it's just the code ahead usually.
Yeah, you're a code ahead, and one of the challenges I think we have with that from both the design side and the construction side is that it's not, you're moving from town to town, they're all in the same area for the most part, right? They're the larger municipalities. But those codes should be vetted through the technical standards board. The reason we do that is because we can compare it to other existing codes, whether it be electrical, plumbing, or fire safety. We don't do that with the stretch code in a way that it should happen. It basically is, here you go. You can take this and run with it. From a practical standpoint, if you talk to code, they're trying to juggle both the existing code and then this other code over here. That's not great, and I don't think it's effective.
Right. So there's two pieces you mentioned. One, I think I heard you say, one is switching to like, put some stronger language than what's in the document right now about adopting code more efficiently, more rapidly, right?
Yes.
And to be in the current cycle of code.
In the current cycle.
And stay there, so you'll have more frequent but less dramatic changes in code adoption over time.
Yeah, and the third piece, you do have reference material is education, but right now we're only educating code officers. What we should really be doing, if we're making incremental changes, and we're doing that right every 3 years, we should be able to educate both the design community and the construction community.
Great, okay. And in doing that, the stretch code becomes less relevant. And your suggestion is, let's leave that aside in our document. It's mentioned here in the recommendation here. Put our eggs more in the basket of everybody adopts the code. There's one other piece that I've heard you talk about as well, which is statewide adoption of the code, as opposed to, some communities of a certain size. I think it's worth out. There's a certain size.
Yeah, so communities under 4,000 do not have the requirement on the enforcement side of the code right now. And when you look at that, the original intention of this is a statewide building code. They're supposed to still build to that. But there's no resource. If you think about towns under 4,000, they probably don't have a resource in many cases to do the actual compliance work. If you were to adopt a person at the state level, like you have for electrical plumbing, that can be that resource, you can do statewide compliance. And overall, that's, I don't know this, but we've run the numbers, and we did do some calculations, but it has to be a much better way to get to your goal of making buildings more efficient.
Okay, all right, Michael's got his hand out. I'm gonna grab Michael, then I'll come in here. Michael.
So I just want to check, I'm trying to scroll through to the part of the draft that Matt is referencing. What is the recommendation to strike the language about the stretch code that is in the report? Or is it to actually, is there a proactive recommendation about what to do with stretch codes in Maine?
Yeah, no, Michael, I would strike that. I actually think it creates confusion, and I would focus on the code adoption cycle and the enforcement position, as well as adding a little more stronger language on the education side. I would also strike the reference to the Pacific Northwest Laboratory report, because that was 2009 compared to 2015, and that number is not accurate.
Right. That's a separate thing. I'm glad you said it, and let's put that aside for 1 second. But Michael, on your point, like what's being proposed here, what I hear is strike the language on stretch code, however, add in new language about more frequent or more, I'm not sure the right word, but timely adoption of code, which seems that is inferred in here, but isn't explicit in the document right now. And a recommendation of a state building inspector and which opens up the possibility of statewide compliance of code. Yeah, Gary.
Well, remember, we are a home rule state. You're gonna get pushback on that, like you did before. Yeah. Be pushback to having everybody under 4,000 have a CEO. It's not gonna go well.
I think that's their recommendation, is that you don't have to have, those towns won't have to have their own code enforcement officer because a statewide building inspector would be available. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar. It's what you have for the existing statute on enforcement. And I do agree, there will be pushback on that, for sure.
One statewide code officer cannot do that. Basically impossible.
I do agree, but I mean, when you look at what we have for resources for both electrical and plumbing, we run into the same challenge.
Yep.
Okay.
Also, the law currently provides for third-party inspectors to be used. We used to have them in the state. They've gone away for now, but there's nothing that would prevent them from coming back if they thought there was they could make a living at it. And so if the laws were enforced in towns under 4,000, I suspect that they would find a market for their services. So this is a pretty involved topic, and it's been part of the reason it doesn't work great is because it's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. So I think I don't disagree with a lot of the comments that are being made. I think it's going to be a little tricky to wordsmith this, and there were a lot of advocates who feel strongly about stretch codes. The stretch codes in Maine are entirely voluntary for a town to opt into. Once a town does opt into it, then it's not voluntary in that town. So far, only a handful have done so. Some people feel like that was a useful tool because they were frustrated with the pace of adoption of the statewide code, the basic code. But Matt is right that there are a significant amount of advantages, I would argue, for having just a single uniform code, and then it's clear to everybody what's going on. But the law today is that there shall be a stretch code. So I'm not sure if this body is ready to recommend that we drop that. I think it's okay to drop reference to it in this report because I don't know that it plays a big role, but I think I'd just like to have a little time to sit with it and reflect the comments we're hearing today.
Third-party inspectors is a very good idea. It's a very good bridge.
Okay, yeah, and I don't think we have to recommend dropping the stretch code now, but I think you can put that aside. Maybe that happens if we can prove that we can adopt the code on a regular basis. Right. Becomes unnecessary.
By not mentioning in here, you're not saying get rid of it. You're just saying that's not the priority for us. The priority is getting the full code updating in that regular cycle.
Can I just say that there are areas like this where while we wordsmith, I think we can say Michael, Matt, Kathleen, Gary, anybody else who sort of wants to think about, is there a strengthening of some of this to make it more clear and effective? We can do it. If anybody else wants to jump into it, just sort of, I want to be transparent that like some offline, make sure we get this right. How can we strengthen this? If everybody's okay with that we can do that in the course of the next couple of days. And then bring back a draft that reflects kind of, I think, the back and forth Matt and Michael just had.
Yeah, I would love to have you all.
Matt, you want to join that? Is that what you're?
Just looking out for cross-laminated timber, which is part of the building code, and I don't know where it stands, but it needs to be factored in so we don't inadvertently block it out, that's all.
I'll check.
Yep.
So check on cross-laminated timber? Okay.
And I think
And
that
we-
was a goal in the last plan, and I think we all agree.
And
I
it's
think,
mentioned in this plan too.
and I think that
I'm not
you
sure
have
if
a
it
good-
relates to that, but yeah.
Check about unintended consequences on cross-laminated timber, okay? Okay, are folks okay with what Hannah said, which is we can gather a bunch of folks from this group who know the most about this topic and come back to you on the 31st with hopefully what will be an elegant revision?
Yes.
That sound good?
David?
Yeah,
Just
Judy.
one other thing to add to that, that's related, very much related to the codes, is on page 45. There's a recommendation for increasing municipal participation in the FEMA community rating system, the CRS system. And it specifically says if you do so, you'll lower flood insurance premiums by 45%. Without a building code, you cannot get a community rating score of better than 9. And that's in us, the worst is 10. So, and there are plenty of towns where it's only gonna benefit a handful of residents. So such a definitive statement about what the benefit is when the building code applies to 87 towns out of 454, which is 19% of Maine towns. This is just a really misleading statement about what the benefit of that enrollment is, because it's impossible to achieve for 80% of Maine towns if they don't have that building code, and they're not required to have it. So that's really digging into some of these details, but I just don't think we should put this out there as woohoo, you could save 45% on insurance bills when it's almost impossible for so many towns to get anywhere near this benefit.
So that statement probably needs some caveating and couching. And it does connect to what we were just saying, which is actually if you put the building codes out to the rest of the
Then
communities
you
in town.
could, yeah.
Yes. So another reason perhaps to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, no community is prevented from doing that, Judy.
Right, but they're not going to.
Well, I'm just saying it is not, prohibited.
Right, those savings are available for the taking. Okay, that's
Yeah,
helpful. So
thinking about
just on the
12 towns statewide do it.
Right. So that's helpful. We will come back to you on the 31st with our vision based on that conversation. The next thing on my punch list is strategy F is really long. And it links to the idea that, the trash and materials management recommendations got woven through a couple different strategies. I think what you were putting on the table there, Melissa, was, hey, what if we pulled out all the trash and materials management and gave it its own happy place? Maybe that would help minimize the length of strategy F and also lift up some of the trash and materials management stuff. Is that kind of what you're thinking, Melissa? Okay.
I would just,
Yeah.
we were encouraged to kind of weave our working group teams through multiple strategies.
Yes.
So by, putting it into its own strategy or into its own group, kind of counter to what a lot of the working group, instructions were.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a tension here because indeed, it's helpful to actually weave some things together, right? And sort of coastal and marine working group has a lot of stuff in different places, like in resilient communities and elsewhere, right? And so I don't know, it's a possibility. I don't know how strongly you feel about it, Melissa, or it's more like,
I feel
hey,
like Melissa maybe also partially just said, the resilience strategy is very heavy.
It's just so it goes from mental health to land use. It's just so broad that I felt like it was a lot for me to interpret. And I feel like to anyone reading the plan for the first time, and I totally understand that all of those things are relevant to resilience, to community resilience. So I don't feel so strongly that the waste part has to be the solution, but I just wonder if there's a way to, I don't know, make it a little more digestible.
Melanie has her hand up.
So I agree. I think we had struggled with the resilience section in part for that same reason. It was very long. It's also an awful lot of what so many of the working groups talked about, right? As far as the waste was concerned, I went through and it looks like the only thing that's in the resilience section was related to the storm debris management. And we had even sort of talked about, do we put some of the waste strategies in the resilience section and said, geez, it's already pretty thick. We've got food strategies that are in natural and working land. So we put actually food waste strategies over in strategy E. And, you know, as Carl said, that sort of reflects like the waste task force was one of our intersecting groups already. You know, so it wasn't even its own designated working group. It sort of came into being because there had been some overlap between the different sort of working group topics. So that, you know, we had followed that same idea of trying to weave it through. But I don't think pulling it out of strategy F is going to make much difference in terms of the overall bulk of that particular section.
It's all, well, it is 9 and 10 too.
I wonder if there's a way,
Oh.
I wonder if there's a way, with this clarity of message that Melissa is giving us, that we can take strategy F and maybe package, trim, whatever, just to make it a clearer story. Right? So it's less like a monolith of lots of different things and more like a story that makes sense, right? Maybe that's the path on this.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to return to, like, I know that we already addressed framework, but that was just, it just really stuck out to me as a lot, so, yeah.
Well, Hannah just corrected me, so for the record, I had not seen the other sections that were in 9 and 10 strategy. So it does make up quite a bit more than, I was wondering where those other pieces had gone, so you found them.
David, do you think the other approach would be acknowledging that section F is meaty and robust and why it is?
Yeah.
Maybe could also help set the stage,
Yep.
a little bit for people who are going to read it.
Yeah, that it touches in so many areas, yeah. Okay, that sound good, yeah, Joyce?
So, one of the thoughts I had is because land use was across so many groups and we had a number of intersecting meeting, should that be its own strategy, or does that be such a controversial topic in some ways, but is it shining light too much on it if it's its own strategy? But that's a pretty large section, but it also really doesn't, for me, quite fit in with this strategy F, because I think it really is so many other things, including transportation and other topics, so I totally get why it's in build healthy and resilient communities, because walkable, livable, you know, all of that. But it just has a lot of other things, so I just offer that as a thought.
Thanks, Joyce. Are we comfortable sending these messages back to the writing team and be like, writing team, see what you can do? Is that okay? Even if we don't solve it right now? Okay.
Let's do that for the writing.
Is the writing team comfortable with that?
I really feel for the writing.
That's a hard.
It's just a vague group,
But I would second what Joyce said though.
Yeah.
Because I think land use and land itself is a very controversial thing, particularly in our state. And yeah, if we go down that path, I think it'll be something else.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna add the thought that they've done a great job, in my opinion, of aggregating this into one less strategy, right? We only have 7. So don't lose the clarity of message in trying to make it perfect, you know, in this regard, so.
Okay, yeah, there definitely is trade-offs there, yeah. Judy, last word, and then we'll.
So one of the things that we discussed in the resilience working group, a little bit tongue in cheek, was a new strategy, I for investment. And number 3, expand access to funding and financing. It could be I for investment. It could also be I for investment and intersecting issues. If we want to really start getting the alliteration, and you could pull investment, waste, and land use out of that. And that might be a way of highlighting that we did look at intersecting issues this time, because we were given that direction. And I don't know, I like to alliterate, so I just thought that might.
I'll only say, Judy, we did get one less strategy, so we are only up to G.
Oh,
So we'd have to add
darn.
H and I. Well, maybe we're headed there, so I mean, I appreciate the effort.
Okay.
Okay. We're gonna do a little lightning round now for a couple of these bullets. You all ready? We have a bullet. Make sure we mention all the other plans. Signal the reading list. Yes, let's do it. How about that? Any problems with that? i.e. the resilience, work commission work, the other stuff that's happening. Great. we have two things on public health that Dr. Bob brought us with. One, some stronger language on page 50 about public health monitoring. It's
She's
not-
gonna have to do it, so.
I know.
I can provide the input, like I can re-review this and
Yeah.
add it separately.
So if we're comfortable with Dr. Baugh going in and putting some stronger language about not only the monitoring, but building up the monitoring infrastructure, great, yeah. And the next one is on the impact of disasters on emergency management. Currently, we talk about assessing infrastructure and things. You had said, what if we assess public health?
Detailed language, and it's similarly, I can go in there and provide some recommended language.
Great, about assessing public health on the back end of disasters. Good? Let's do it. Okay. Next, on page 39. I need to turn there. I think this was Susan Earl was saying. The top two paragraphs on page 39 kind of missed the mark in terms of size and scale, the importance of fishery as a lifeline to coastal communities, and also speaking about communities that lack other economic opportunities. And so there was, I think it was Susan. Yeah, saying, can we fix that language in 39 to right size it to the dimension, both the dimension of the industry of fishing, lobstering and fishing, other fishing, and the nature of, sometimes we use the word dependency, she didn't use that one, but the importance of that for coastal communities.
Can I just, I didn't disagree with what Susie mentioned to emphasize the importance of fisheries. I would actually only just not take issue, but just to say, I think we could include kind of a sidebar of the scale of these industries, because I think agriculture and forestry have almost the same impact for other communities in Maine, and that we might kind of call out all three as kind of fundamental to the Maine economy. We can add some more statistics about just the value of fisheries and how they're laid out, but I would actually just say, I don't think we intend in this plan to say fishing is more important than forestry and farming, because they're pretty similar in different parts of the state in terms of their value and their impact.
Impact on those communities.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Matt, Melissa, do you agree with that?
can I chime in?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, my intent wasn't to compare those industries. It was, the hangup was really in how that second paragraph on page 39 was worded around marine businesses specifically. And I think the intent of that paragraph was to kind of merge three of the recommendations coming out of the Fisheries and Aquaculture Subcommittee of the Coastal and Marine Working Group. And the way it sounded to me was that access to emerging or underutilized or even invasive species were going to make up for job losses in other fisheries. And so that's why I was emphasizing the scale and the mismatch in scale of the lobster industry to some of the emerging fisheries that are available. So I just suggested to Molly and to the others that are on Zoom some suggested language that just puts that into context and I think eliminates the confusion that I felt when I read that paragraph, but still gets at the intent of the inclusion of those three specific recommendations from fisheries and aquaculture.
Great. Any concerns with that? So essentially, getting the language right in those paragraphs, and if we can figure out how to do it well, a call out that speaks to the importance, or the localized in particular importance of these industries on communities. Okay. Fisheries, ag, and forestry. Great. Land use. There was a comment, and this is from Pat, about need a more comprehensive land use plan that matches our needs, whether it's renewable energy and other needs, right? And which could be in the land use section or the energy section. This is one of these ones where actually it's useful to spend a little time with the document and see what's in there. I'm not sure we have time to do that right now, but I'm curious, Pat, what I'm most familiar with in the document is around how we talk about it in the build out renewable energy in strategy C. So if you look at page, hang on 1 second. If you look at page 22, there's a lot of bullets on 22. Dan's got a lot of work.
Those will go on page 52.
And on 52 as well?
Yeah, I think the issue is this, we're participating in rulemaking to protect forest land and agricultural land in terms of developing a mitigation strategy for solar development. The result is we're gonna push a lot of development incentives into the unorganized territory, which is not what we wanna do, because it's so hard to site these facilities and match those agricultural needs against the need to have solar in closer to where the load is. So we haven't thought that through. We've gone ahead and started figuring out ways to restrict solar, but we haven't figured out where we want it. And that's a bigger policy discussion. I see a lot of language on page 53 and 23, but what we're in real life experiencing is you're treading on private landowner value, you're treading on societal needs, climate action goal for more solar development, farming issues, forestry issues. I mean, the best example I can give of this is when we reached this point with wind power, we put together an expedited wind power process that looked at where do we want wind power and how do we iron out all those issues instead of creating a series of prohibitions. So what am I saying? I don't know. It's more complicated than any of the single sentences I've seen here.
Yeah.
It's a policy directive to think about all these interactions and not to just do them in silos.
And I would just say to you, Pat, I think the climate council members who were involved in sort of intersecting land use made the exact same point you are about how we need clear data and a plan about where we want things, especially renewable energy. And so I think unless anybody agrees with Pat, we can try to reflect that more clearly in the plan, because I definitely think that, does anybody disagree with what Pat's saying?
Why don't we find a way to do that in, Gary?
Is it necessary, Pat, to raise just the point here? You were talking about the LUPC comprehensive land use plan separate from the state?
No, it's the way the regulations are starting to the messages we're giving developers is get out of Southern Maine because it's gonna be too expensive, but Ken, I think you'd agree, we probably want solar closer to the load.
Where possible.
Yeah.
And certainly, let's use the rooftops that exist as well.
Yeah.
Especially big box.
So we've got we're beating one another up over an impossible situation. So I was hoping this group could come up with language that might center us a little bit as we go forward with that effort.
So, Matt, one quick comment on that. I want to be respectful of time. Actually, do we have till 12:30?
It's 12:58.
Oh my God, we have till 1. Yes, it's in 1 minute. Okay, sorry.
Bending time?
I was like, oh, another half hour. No, we don't. Matt.
Concur with Pat completely, and from a developer perspective, this has been an ongoing conversation about whether they even consider Maine because of these challenges, and I think it puts Dan and his folks in a really tough position to balance what we're asking him to do, and then what we said earlier, which is be cost conscious. That doesn't work, so I hope we can find a way to make this work.
And the mitigation is tied to helping fund, land acquisitions in the future. So this crosses all sorts of interests of the Climate Council that need to be pulled together, I think.
So I would just note, I think this is probably a good example of potentially unintended consequences where, the basis for the legislation that directed the rulemaking was to protect undeveloped habitat blocks, with climate change and habitat migration as part of the issue that was in the forefront behind that legislation. And so the law was passed thinking we want to protect habitat at large, recognizing lots of it is being converted to renewable energy development and try to preserve that for these species that are migrating because their habitats are changing due to climate change. But then it has this limiting effect, it, runs at direct cross purposes to other climate change related priorities, which we end up facing all the time, that everybody wants things both ways.
You're the bad guy.
Right.
It's Melanie's fault.
It is. It's our rule, it's the law.
I don't wanna fight with it.
Well, no, but I just would say, I feel like that was the crux of the conversation we're trying to get at, and honestly, even I'm thinking about Joyce's point of like, how do we pull it out? Because I would say so much of the climate council's goals, they do overlap and intersect and conflict at times, so we'll think about how to make your point, Pat, and just sort of say that this is a clear goal the climate council has that we need to resolve. Or try to create more structure to resolve.
Yeah, it's just, you can't do pieces of it in isolation and it's more complicated, but that's what we gotta do.
Yeah.
And make
So-
progress.
So we're at time. Luckily, we're at the end of the bullets. The only other bullets left were strategy E language tweaks, fine, send them in, as long as they're not substantive, great. And then link to more detail in the working group document, which we talked about earlier. Yeah, we can do that. No problem. So those were our bullets. Congratulations, you made it through. Fantastic. There's a few where we need to circle back on the 31st, like for instance, on the stretch code and the code issues, we need to look at some language on that. The one we just talked about, in terms of land use policy, we need to look at some language on that on the 31st. And then on the 31st, we're also gonna finalize what we look at for the targets. And hopefully come back to you with some greater clarity around hydrogen and that kind of stuff. Kathleen, then Noel?
Okay, you just said that. I'm just feeling uncomfortable with where we are on hydrogen, and I know we're gonna see some more scenarios. But seeing those results and thinking about being super dependent on something we didn't spend much time analyzing, either in the working groups or together, is giving me a little bit of anxiety, and
Yeah.
so just wanting to make sure, and maybe that's all gonna be resolved through these extra scenarios, but I'm wondering if there are other categories of emission reductions that we might expect to pop up between now and next week, either because we want them there, or like this, they just weren't on our radar and the modelers are gonna bring them to us. And that's just a super quick
We
question.
hope,
Yeah.
we feel your pain and we hope to bring you something that makes sense. And we'll set more time aside in our 2-hour block if that's not the case.
And I think that we've been clear with the modelers too, that we need to focus the targets that we're considering on the strategies that have been identified by the council and by the working group. That, we appreciate that this is something that they've modeled for other states, but it's not something that we had evaluated closely. So we had similar discomfort when that appeared, that that's not something that's really been thoroughly evaluated.
And it could be that when we talk about this next week, there is a need to put something in this plan, right? About how you walk forward on a hydrogen path.
Right, we should
It may not be
explore
there.
it.
Evaluate it.
Well,
It's a specific topic, that's right.
Just because we're talking about this right now, I think mentioning something about looking at other pathways, I think would be really helpful, I think. At least mention like hydrogen and other things. But I'm not suggesting we get into that conversation now.
Yeah, okay.
Everyone wants to go home. But I thought funding was on that list, right? And plan to get to that would be
So
helpful.
the funding conversation where we landed was the conversation about the need to mention, well, we're talking about Dan Cleben and others, right? So that we're gonna need to mention more clearly in this document. That's one of those areas where the writing team will come back next week. But how do we mention more quickly in this document the need to lift up these different funding sources and leverage these different funding sources, whether it's private, philanthropic, federal, and state, right? And so how do we do that in a clearer way about the need? Now, it may not go as far as what you're saying, Noel, which is, here's a total number of what we need and this is how we're gonna go
I'm
get
not
it.
suggesting we do.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay, but yeah, the funding, what will happen between now and next week is some clearer statements about how you leverage these different pieces of funding and the need to do that urgently to make this plan work.
And one other thing, and education as well is a key piece, which shows up in different ways through all of these, but not as strongly. If you're talking, if you're saying that we want the words and the language in here to be really overt and strong, I don't feel like it's strong enough it's not highlighting the need for us to educate Maine as a community around climate change itself and the urgency and how the plan could actually make a difference. So
Maybe that's an overarching theme.
yes.
Because it did come up a lot.
Yeah, it did, and it's
And there is a
mentioned here and
chapter at
there,
the end, but I think that could be an overarching.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing, now we need to go, but Noel, if you want to think about that strategy G and how it might be naming that and or at the top of the document and thematically, think about that.
Yeah, I can do that.
All right, folks, we did it. Thank you. That was hard and we got through a bunch of stuff. We still have work to do next week. We'll see you next Thursday online. It's a 2-hour meeting, which we will need to be very efficient in. And we are hopeful, our goal next week is to sign off on this overall content of the plan. And that's our job, your job as a council to do that. So that's our goal for next week. Feel free to reach out to your co-chairs.
I know the writing team has a
And the writing team has got a big
But the
job.
more time you can give us to read the final version, that'd be great.
Kudos to the writing department.
Yeah, kudos to writing.
Looking forward to that 175 pages.
Thanks everyone who joined us online. Appreciate you signing in. We'll stop the meeting now. Thanks everyone. Have a good day. By the way, in the room, there's plenty of food left, so take some food home for your kids or your family or whoever.